No, I'm a so and so for seasonal viewing as well. There are certain things that I do tend to like. This is kind of why we're here, because I really enjoyed that first season that we did, so to speak.
Yeah.
Those 4, one a week through October. I can't even, was that 2 years ago or something?
Yeah, I think it was, or maybe even longer. Actually,
yeah,
it was a while ago.
I'm a very Halloweeny, autumnal sort of person. I love this time of year, and I definitely take the opportunity to indulge in the sorts of stories and media that I particularly love at this time when it seems very appropriate. Like I always listen to the audiobook of the Amityville Horror in October. Yeah, it's crap, but I love it.
It's a shite. It is absolute.
That's another thing.
Garbage. But
one of these days, I'll pull the trigger on that blog project as well.
But no, like absolutely, I'm absolutely the same. Another thing I tend to watch around this time is Nightmare.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I always rewatch Nightmare around this time because it aired around this time, you see, when I was a kid. So it evokes all sorts of associations. And
sorry, which Nightmare? Because there's a couple of competing things in my head.
The children's television show.
Right.
The helmets and the virtual dungeon.
I'm with you. Nightmare with a K. Yeah.
Yes, Nightmare with a K. That's
just because I'm aware of a film called Nightmare from the 60s, which is like one of the glut of post-psycho films. And
no, not that one. Not that one. No,
that's not very good. Although it does contain one of my all-time favourite lines from a film, and I think I can't remember the actress, but of course it's that wonderful way that certain words and phrases were used quite differently, she's married to someone. He's a bit of a cad and a bounder, but she's basically at the end of her tether with him, and she says, but it's this marvelous moment where she looks at him and says, "You may have been some kind of gay boy before, but you're married to me now. Come death to us part, so get used to it." I think that's got such a wonderful connotations now, and I wish that had actually been part of the narrative, that he was, off having these extramarital affairs with young men or something. That would have made the film more interesting.
I don't know why. As you were saying it there, Elliot, I saw it printed out in white on a black shirt, and I kind of want it.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I guess it must be a famous quote.
I want that. I want it in my head, Absolutely want it.
But the film would have been improved 100-fold if that had been
we need to repopularize the film so that quote becomes famous, and then we can market those T-shirts.
Yeah, someone got me a T-shirt because I'm my and again it's this time of year. One of my rather sordid secrets in terms of my viewing is that I am a bit of a sucker for one of the most exploitative and just horrible films canons going, and that's the movies of Pete Walker. And basically because I adore Sheila Keith, who's just she really should have taken her place alongside Cushing and Lee as among the pantheon of great horror stars, except that she was in some of the worst films ever made. But I've got a fantastic T-shirt that a friend of mine made me of her, which has the quotation, "I'm going to make you thoroughly ashamed of your body. I'm going to see to that personally," which is a quotation from the luridly titled House of Whipcord, which is a film that has to be seen, or maybe not, to be believed.
Yeah.
But the great thing about these kinds of films, I watched one sort of, I was having a kind of pre-Halloween vibe, and I thought I'm gonna watch this particular movie, which is a character actor called Anthony Schaff in it, who was very famous on television in the 60s and 70s, usually for playing vicars, but he always played these kind of tertiary characters, and they turn up in things like Steptoe and Son. I think he was the Steptoe and Son vicar, and he would be in Hancock's Half Hour and things like that. But he was cast basically to play a vicar again in this particular Pete Walker movie, another House of, this time House of Mortal Sin. And you can absolutely tell this is an actor who's always had kind of bit parts, who's always, no matter the qualities or lack of, in terms of this movie, he seizes this to absolutely play the thing to extraordinary levels. This this demented Catholic priest. I mean, he's incredible. The film is not worthy.
No. I've got such an amount of time for that. You know, when actors know that they're in a bad film, but they're just giving it their all. They're just doing a good job with it. I love that. I love that to bits.
And that thing you're talking about, that happens a lot in old Doctor Who and things like it, because they draft in these actors who have been bit part guys on TV and character actors, minor character actors for years, you know, long careers doing that, and suddenly they're in these 4 episodes of Doctor Who or this 45 minutes of the Avengers or something like that, and they've got a major role, you know, that they're the main villain or something, and they're having the time of their lives, you know, they really sink their teeth into it.
Well, I was astonished to read.
Hello?
Oh no! Oh no!
Oh no! Not the curse again.
I was going to say, is this the curse again? Hello?
Because we're trying to do the it's the Spooktober. It's haunted. It's uncanny.
It is. It's uncanny, isn't it? We go through doing like Hannibal, and we have no issues. It's fine. It's smooth as silk, you know.
Yeah.
Smooth as one of Hannibal's ties, you know.
I was just about to say smooth as Hannibal's tie.
And then we come round to doing all the supernatural, spooky stuff, and suddenly,
Ghost is in the machine.
Yeah, clearly,
it's in the computer.
Oh no! Oh, he could hear us, but we can't hear you. It's sort of like it's sputtering. It's coming through in fits and starts for some reason.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
No, not now. It's gone completely.
Did I hear you chuckling there? I think I just about heard a chuckle. That was you chuckling.
Okay. Yeah, I was chuckling there. Just the general situation, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I think you need your techie back.
Yeah. Oh, this could be an internet issue, though.
Oh, yes, it is.
Oh, is that?
Oh, he came back and then went again. That sounds like an internet connection issue to me.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, signal.
It really does.
Yeah.
Which is problematic because that is insurmountable if it's going to keep doing that. Yeah, I know, right? Oh no.
Yeah.
Hopefully it'll swing back in. You know, whatever's disrupting it, if the signal has dropped or whatever, it'll just come back or something.
Yeah, I get that with my Wi-Fi. It just suddenly drops out for 5 minutes or something.
Yeah, occasionally, every so often. It
now
does
I've got them back.
Oh, hello.
So, hello. Sorry,
hello.
My internet my internet just went
cacked out. Yeah, we thought it was that. It sounded like an internet issue. So
but it's back now. I was just going to say that I read a quote really recently about what Jack was saying about these guest actors who are drafted into things, and it just so happened we were watching something and Philip Maddock was in it, and I said, what an enviable career for an actor. I mean, he's been in everything. He's done so much, and I think I must have gone on his IMDb or something just to get the full list. And there was a little thing on there saying Philip Maddock's favourite role was that of Solon in Doctor Who, The Brain of Morbius. And I thought, really? Of all the things you did, that was your most coveted role? I mean, because you tend to think, regardless of, I'm a fan of Doctor Who, I love Doctor Who, but these are jobbing actors, and although jobbing actors will give their, invariably their best, it's like, it's just a job. It's just a job on a kids show between, my stints at the National Theatre or whatever, or a bigger film. But he said, I absolutely loved it. I thought the material was brilliant.
Have you ever heard of Frank Langella talking about his favourite role?
No.
His favourite role, of all the many, many storied and legendary roles that he's had, his favourite role is Skeletor in the Masters of the Universe film.
Brilliant.
He said he had the most fun with that.
He is the best thing in that movie.
Well, by a country mile, right? I mean, like, everything else is terrible. Like, everything else is just garbage in it. He's wonderful. He's
Well,
just
that's preserved in
yeah.
my childhood memory because I've never seen it since. Because that was the year where I was taken to the cinema, and I think the films that I saw in that year, which I have never seen since, were the films that really started to register in a slightly different way. And I remember it was that Masters of the Universe and Inner Space were the two films I was taken
Oh
to.
my
I've
goodness!
not seen either of them since, and I have no intention to, because they're preserved in my memory as being really sort of great trips to the cinema as a bairn, But I imagine they're both awful. But
yeah, Masters of the Universe is pretty much tosh, and it's a big but. It's a lot of fun. It's an enormous amount of fun, largely because of Frank Langella playing Skeletor.
Yeah,
and just
exactly. I throw that on every now and again just for him.
Making a virtue.
Maybe I should look back at it.
A better thing to do is just go onto YouTube and find those videos where it's just his bits all the way through, And apparently he ad-libbed a lot of that.
Oh wow!
Because in the script, Skeletor was just like villain X. He could have been anyone, Could have been lifted from any 1980s cartoon, apparently. So he added in all of this poetic stuff, about where, when he turns to He-Man.
See, I
tell
love
me
that,
about the loneliness of good He-Man. Is it equal to the loneliness of evil and all this stuff,
Again, I love it when actors do that because there's a rather infamous Doctor Who story, which even in Doctor Who circles, where we're very kind to the series, by and large. Where this one is like considered a bit of a dog's breakfast, even by people who are sort of apologists for it. And it's a story called Time Lash. But the real saving grace of this story is the actor they've drafted in for the villain did a similar thing. He started rewriting all over the place and rewriting this very poetic dialogue to replace the kind of banal villain's dialogue he was given. And there's this wonderful line which is all his, where I think the script had said something like, your classic, you lie, doctor, blah, ha, 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 ha. And the actor in question changed it to, it's imprinted on my brain because it's just a great line for that kind of genre. And he says, what is this, Doctor? Another trip into the realms of duplicity, which is just so much better. It's like, yeah, that's what I want. It's even better than that. Another excursion into the realms of duplicity. It's like, that's what you want. That's the kind. Give us more of that.
That's brilliant. Oh,
just throw some syllables at it.
Yeah, let's make it rock. Yeah,
yeah.
Love it.
There's a particular writer on the old series, Robert Holmes, who's very good at insults. So you have these, you chicken-brained biological disaster is one particular line.
Biological disaster. That is a fantastic put down, isn't it? I'm going to register that one, I think.
I mean, the actor getting that through the post and going, oh my God, I get to call someone a biological disaster.
That was Maddock, wasn't it?
That was Maddock. Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's probably
I will reserve that for if I ever meet us.
Such a great actor, Philip Maddock. I was a very young Doctor Who fan, obviously, and I'd seen, because he did several over the years in the classic series, and I'd seen at least two of them on VHS, particularly that one, Brain of Morbius. By the time I went I was very young, I went with my school to see the Trevor Nunn stage production of Measure for Measure.
Oh, he's the Duke, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was the Duke.
Yeah.
That, and I didn't recognize him, because I was too young to sort of be aware of actors' names and things like that. I was enjoying Doctor Who on the level of just purely on the level of story at that point. I wasn't steeped in the behind the scenes stuff as I later came to be. So I didn't know that the actor who played Solon in Brain of Morbius was called Philip Maddock. But yeah, I went to see that. It was not quite, but nearly the first stage Shakespeare I ever saw. And it's a wonderful, wonderful production. Really, really good. It's burned into my memory, despite the fact it was ages ago and I was quite a young kid. But yeah, watching it, I did not realize.
It's a remembered version of Measure, actually. Yeah.
Sorry,
but it's also, I said, it's a very well remembered version of Measure, that actually. In the sort of and also the production. It's an acclaimed one. I said, but it's that thing. I mean, he's
Philip Maddock, Claire Skinner, David Haig,
Claire
Peter
Skinner,
Hugo
yeah,
Galley.
that's right.
Great cast.
Yeah.
Great
Yeah.
cast.
Very good cut. Yeah,
I've actually been
I think
rewatching out of sentiment. Again, it's because of this seasonal thing. I get kind of like sentimental and slightly nostalgic around this era. I've been watching the 1980s BBC productions of the Chronicles of Narnia. And that has a very similar feeling to like early Who, you know. It's so wonderful. It's so wonderful.
And a much bigger budget.
Yeah. Even I mean, like, you watch interviews and things from the time. This was a big deal, right? This was a huge production for the BBC, and that's what you can feel in it. I mean, it looks very ropey these days, obviously, but there's this sense that everyone in it really cares. Everyone involved really cares about what they're doing. And I love how it's like a window into a time of television, a period or an era of television. There's just no way you'd get away with it now. Everything has to be sort of like gritty and realist and whatnot. The acting is wonderful because it is stage acting. Everything is huge and theatrical. Barbara Kellerman, who plays the White Witch, oh my God, she's amazing. Yeah. She's absolutely incredible. Everything, you know, the rule that you dial it down when you're in front of the camera. No. She doesn't bother. She just goes full tilt. She stares right into it, and you can just see emotion seething out of her. She is wonderful in it.
I mean, I always use the same thing. It's one of those guides, but I don't think it's a rule, because ultimately, as long as you are truthful, I mean, the most acclaimed actor of his generation, Daniel Day-Lewis, is massive on screen.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, you know, and I don't think he's just some kind of outlier. There are a number of actors who are like that, who
I mean,
are
like
expressionistic. If it is part of their thing, their vibe. I mean, Jack Nicholson is another. If it's part of their, but as long as they are truthful in the piece they're doing, you can get away with much.
Another fabulous example from the series is the adaptation of The Silver Chair that comes later. You've got Tom Baker as Puddleglum, you know?
That's right, yeah. Tom pops up as Puddleglum, and he's really good.
Oh my God, he dominates. He dominates the entire thing. I mean, that's the best of the adaptations for my money. It's just a stunning adaptation, that is. And he is amazing. In fact, there is a sequence where you've got him and Barbara Kellerman like in close proximity, just being big at one another, you know. And it's great. It's absolutely wonderful.
I think in a strange sort of way, it helped him that he effectively became an outsider again, because of typecasting, and because it was difficult to find work after you've played this iconic role for years and years and years, and you haven't always been the most gracious leading man. I think to have been made an outsider again actually really helped his work, because he does a couple of things around the 90s, like Selling Hitler being another one, where he puts in some really great performances. Sometimes you need the shock of, oh my God, you know, I'm not going to be a star forever.
No, I mean, on the other hand, towards later on in the 90s, he does star he's part of the Dungeons and Dragons film, and the less said about that, the better.
Is he? I've never seen that.
Oh yeah,
largely because he turned down Lord of the Rings, didn't he? Of course.
Did he? What was he going?
I mean, Peter Jackson's a huge Doctor Who fan, and he basically offered him Gandalf.
Oh, and I'm glad that didn't happen. I'm glad that didn't happen.
Tom Baker just basically said,
he's not right as Gandalf.
I don't want to go to New Zealand for 3 years.
Oh, you fool, Tom.
I know. I heard about Sylvester. Of course, Sylvester McCoy ended up in the Hobbit trilogy as Radagast. I heard about him being considered for Bilbo in the original trilogy. I've heard about that. Never heard that Tom was offered Gandalf.
Wow.
That's
incredible.
What I've read. I mean, whether the validity or reliability of that piece, but that is what I've read.
I'm kind of glad that didn't happen. It just doesn't feel right for me.
I don't think he's bothered, because, like you said, I just didn't want to be away from home for 3 years.
No
matter
of course.
what size of the paycheck and the importance of the role. But of course, yes. I mean, Ian Holm was basically the studio pushed for someone bigger for Bilbo, because Sylvester McCoy was Peter Jackson's choice there.
That's interesting. I mean,
and,
bizarrely, it turned out quite well. I mean, Ian Holm's wonderful as Bilbo.
That's right. Having played Frodo in the classic BBC radio adaptation of
how bizarre, right? How bizarre
when you go back. Yeah. But they did have some casting trouble with that, didn't they? Because Viggo Mortensen, I can't remember who the original I can't remember who the original one was.
Stuart Townsend, was it?
I don't remember, probably, but yeah, they got out there and they got into filming and it just wasn't working.
It wasn't working. No,
it was a bit like
friction, apparently.
Harvey Keitel just didn't work in Apocalypse Now, so they had to swap him out. It's a bit like that, It happens sometimes.
I mean, what a strange piece of almost like cinematic magic, or almost like a miracle, right? It's like the movie gods are looking down upon this production and saying, "No, this is the one you want. This is Aragorn. Here he is. Yeah. There you are."
That trilogy is. Whatever you think about it, it really does work spectacularly well.
Oh, it's beautiful. I mean, it's the sort of like the more, obviously it's not present day anymore, but it's the more up to date Harryhausen, isn't it? Really, that's the style or the tradition of film. But it is beautiful. I mean, I've been back to rewatch it recently. I remember going to see it because I was at the time I was 19. I was coming out of my Tolkien phase. I was still a huge Tolkien fan, so I was very apprehensive and very cynical going in. I mean, so cynical. I was like, this isn't going to work. There's no way this is going to be good, And I remember being rooted to my seat. I remember being like awed at how right it all was. I mean, I know that obviously there's it's a film, it's an adaptation, there's differences, but in terms of like the aesthetics, the feeling, the ethos of Middle Earth and the characters and whatnot, it just works. Everything is beautiful in it. I was stunned.
I reread the original books last year, actually, funnily enough, just sort of
as I did.
I didn't see any of the original Lord of the Rings movies at the cinema because I don't know, I was at the age and my Tolkien phase was long behind me by that point, and it was the early 2000s, so I was very, very steeped in like politics and stuff at the time. So I saw them later. Somebody gave me the DVD set of the extended versions, and
those are the ones to watch as well.
Worked my way through. Yeah, and it's funny, the first one, it didn't quite work for me at first. I was like, and then on a rewatch, I sort of realized how bloody amazing it was.
I had to have my Tolkien face up by the skin of my teeth because it had just been something that had never. I mean, my uncle was a huge fan, and he would read Lord of the Rings every couple of years. Yeah, he was a bit like Christopher Lee with it, to be honest. He would read it once every 2 years.
From the ages of like 6 to the ages of about 13, I read it once a year, every year. I was such a little fanboy.
I had never had, and I think for me the reason that I hadn't got into it as a book series was that it seemed when I was growing up there was such a glut of very bad fantasy on screen. And there was a number of things I didn't really like. There was good children's fantasy, like I loved Return to Oz, for example.
Yes.
I loved things like
that. You were talking about, cinematic visits to the cinema as a kid that are burned into your brain. That's one for me. I went to see Return to Oz at the cinema when I was very young, like Superman 3 as well, actually, and they're
marvelous.
both completely burned into the grey matter.
They would be if you were young, if you're a young child, because they both have really disturbing and distressing elements.
But the thing was that
Superman 3, the best Superman film.
Yeah,
I stand by
in
that.
So many ways, absolutely.
To the grave.
Yeah, absolutely.
It always scared me. It always scared me. That sequence with the computer and the woman and the cybernetic woman thing, that scared the bejesus out of me. I don't know why.
The fight in the junkyard, it's savage.
Yeah,
it's really savage.
Anyway, sorry.
I was just going to say that but there was also a lot of bad fantasy, and there was fantasy even as when I was a kid was like I can't get invested in this. So I think the hangover from that, as I sort of went into adolescence, was maybe that's what Lord of the Rings is like. So I never read it, and then it was. Suddenly there was this, finally a live action version of Lord of the Rings. My friend Martin, who was a huge fan, he says, you have got to have your own vision of this before this movie comes out.
Yeah,
so he threw the books at me, and I said, well, okay, I had however, I think I had something stupid like about a month until the
Right.
film came back.
And these are big books, right? This is a big old wedge of text.
This is the mistake I made. So I started reading it, and my then girlfriend said, "Oh, I've never read them either."
Oh dear.
So I ended up having to do what I do now, which is read things aloud to Vicky, which is well, I did everything, and went, well, that's got to be an interesting adaptation. Went to the cinema, and of course it stopped, and I'd done the whole bloody thing. I only needed to do a third of it. But my friend Martin still said, "No, you did the right thing. You did the right thing."
Yeah, you did.
They don't quite map onto each other, do they? This is the interesting thing.
No.
This is what I was saying before. They are quite faithful adaptations. Surprising, I was surprised by how faithful they were when I reread the books last year. But the big difference is the way the narrative has to be rearranged for screen, because Tolkien, he doesn't tell the story in order. He does something that ought to be really alienating, actually, which is that he sort of tells it in blocks concerning groups of characters, doesn't he? And he does a great he follows Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas for a huge chunk of one of the books, almost to the very end. And then he switches to Frodo and Sam, and you've gone
Gollum,
back in time. You're going to be reading about the same period of time.
Yes, of course, yeah. There is a slightly odd thing that happens in the second movie, or it might be the third, though, and I remember giggling in the cinema, a bit uncharitably, because it's very hard to balance all these narratives, but it cut away from Pippin and Merry being carried along by the Ent, and it was about 45 minutes in a battle scene, and it went back, and I went, "Oh my God, they're still on that bloody Ent! It's been carrying them for days." And of course, it's the only other flaw in the movie. Really, is the fact that it's like, why couldn't you have got someone else to voice it? That's clearly John Rhys Davies.
Yes, it's clearly Gimli, right?
It's like there are so many actors in Australia who could just, New Zealand, beg your pardon, who could have just come in and done the voice.
Also, that whole section with the Ents, it goes on far too long. It's at least in the extended version. It's great. It's great, fine, but they don't see the problem. It's one of the problems with the faithfulness, which is that they're kind of faithful to the stretch of time and space that it takes up within the book, but they cut out loads of the stuff that's interesting about the Ents, because you get into the lore about their past and where they come from and who they are, and the search for the Entwives and all that stuff, which you can't really do on screen, because it really is literally just Treebeard talking to them.
Exactly. That's radio.
It still takes as long as it would if you had all those conversations.
It's like a lot of stuff in the books as well that goes absolutely nowhere, right? It's like the character of Glorfindel. Now, Glorfindel is interesting if you've read the Silmarillion. If you haven't, he's a character who turns up, does a little bit for about, not even like a few minutes of screen time, and then buggers off again and does nothing else. That's it. That's his entire
one of these
role.
smarter, more radical moves they make is with Arwen.
Arwen, that's it. They give some of Glorfindel's stuff to Arwen, which is a good call.
It's a good.
Yeah, it is a good call. That's
right?
I mean, I bet I can just imagine. That must have caused so many headaches around the table. Yeah, but
wow, you should.
It's a really decent move.
It's a really good move, and the Tolkien purists hate it, obviously, but you just can't do it. I mean, just casting a character to be in the film, an actor to be in the film for that length of time, it's like, and also for an audience, if you don't know the Lord of the Rings, and it's certainly if you don't know the Silmarillion, Glorfindel is like, who's he? Exactly. And why has he gone away? Why has he gone away again?
Yeah.
Also, I mean, this is actually it is kind of a problem in a way with the source material. Why doesn't he go with them? This great elf lord who's ancient beyond days and has fought like the ancient dragons and balrogs of Middle Earth, and can fight the Nazgul. Can actually see off the Nazgul on his own.
Bloody useful.
Pretty damn useful. Why doesn't he go with them?
It's like the old saw about, why don't
About
the eagles take
yes.
the
Because you don't get a story.
If you read The Hobbit, they have very good reasons for not doing that. But
well,
yeah,
I mean, even in the Lord of the Rings, if they go on the eagle, Sauron's going to see them. He's just going to see them and Nazgul after them.
As I recall, the eagles are kind of no, don't. There's nothing to do with us. Not interested, except sort of Gandalf says, actually, could you give a helping hand? And like the lead eagle kind of says, right,
okay,
that's what it's like.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why the original film trilogy works so well, because they don't explain things like that, but they create an atmosphere where you feel like somebody knows why these things are happening or not happening. You don't really understand why the elves aren't joining in the fight until eventually they do. But you feel the way it's portrayed and the atmosphere and the mood and the performances, you feel that they have their reasons. You just haven't heard of them.
It's quite clever in that regard, isn't it?
Yeah,
it implies
it's
quite a lot,
Rather
than ironically doing the Tolkien thing, which is, in the books, one of, I suppose it could be regarded as a flaw in many respects, but it is just the nature of that storytelling, where you have characters literally sat around a table explaining the plot for 30 odd pages.
When I went back to it last year, I was kind of dreading it. I was thinking this is going to be a trudge. I found it went down surprisingly easily. Actually, I found it surprisingly easy. Certain sections more than others, certainly, but and I thought he's been very ill served by his imitators, because he's spawned really a subgenre, isn't it? I mean,
total subgenre.
Fantasy for a very long time, less so now, but fantasy for a very long time was just defined by basically these tropes that he created, orcs and elves and hobbits. Essentially, they're given different names, but essentially, they're mostly nowhere near as good as the original thing. And I think he's in some people's minds, the original trilogy is kind of tarnished by association with all these imitators in the subgenre. When you go back to the original, it's surprisingly philosophically and morally complex and thoughtful. I was actually really quite impressed.
Give it credit for, right? More so than people give it credit for.
Yeah.
And it is very beautiful as well. I mean, that's the other thing. It is just aesthetically, it's really, really beautiful. And I've got such time for the fact that this guy dedicated pretty much his entire life to creating this world.
And it's so strange, because I read a book about the Inklings last year as well, sort of that entire coterie of people, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and
of course Mervyn Peake and that lot.
What's the guy's name? I was going to, because this description of him and his books in the book I read about the Inklings was so fascinating that I was going to seek him out and read all his books, and I can't remember his name. But he wrote apparently these amazing dark fantasy novels with a sort of eccentric Christian inflection and stuff. These are really interesting guys. And now I can't remember where I was going with this, but
I don't know. I was just thinking of Alan Garner, but he was later on, wasn't he? Alan Garner. He was sort of like a generation removed, wasn't he?
Well, there was Hugo Dyson, wasn't there, and a couple of others. Obviously, Tolkien and
there was Tolkien.
Charles Williams. Charles Williams. Ursula K. Le Guin was...
that's right.
Oh, Charles Williams.
There you go. I was thinking of Charles Williams.
Oh, brilliant! There you go. Got there in the end.
He's in the to be read pile. He sounds really interesting.
So we're basically on a busman's holiday tonight, because if I got the measure of this correctly, Hannibal Digested is just going on a little holiday while we do this Halloween special. But we are making the transition by staying basically adjacent to it with the still, to my mind, amusingly named Manhunter.
The name.
But I think that was because they didn't want it to be confused with being. I mean, we were only 13 years. Right? Yeah, exactly. It's like everyone's going to think it's Enter the Dragon or something.
And I believe it was Dino De Laurentiis who mooted that. I believe it was.
He was. Dino.
Nobody liked it
everywhere in the 80s. No, nobody liked him on Flash Gordon either.
No, and nobody liked the name of this film.
I'm so sorry. I think you mean nobody liked Dino De Laurentiis.
Oh, no. I have no idea about that side of the politics, but nobody liked the name of the film involved. Everybody's been quite excoriating about it in retrospect.
Right.
And it is a bit lame, isn't it? It is a bit of a lame
just
title.
feels like someone's just come up with it at the last minute and like, well, Manhunter.
Yeah, we can't call it Red Dragon, so let's call it Manhunter. Why not?
It's got a really strange typeface when it comes up at the start. The title card.
Doesn't it?
Yeah,
just?
it's almost it looks like the sort of typeface or font that you'd use for the titles of like a comedy film.
That's exactly what
It's really odd.
It's bubbly. The font is really sort of like soft and bubbly and weird, and that's a kind of like tonal inconsistency that you find throughout the entire film. It's such a weird chimeric,
very peculiar choices in this film. Very peculiar choices.
I mean, I
finally sort of wrenched ourselves around to talking about it. So should we start?
It's a bizarre beastie. I mean, most people obviously, when they think of Hannibal Lecter, they either think of these days it's either largely the Brian Fuller series or it's Silence of the Lambs. Yeah, this one was lost to time for a little while, certainly in the wake of the Silence of the Lambs, because that was huge, wasn't it? That was a phenomena in the 1990s. It basically buried this film. I mean, this film wasn't that well received when it came out anyway. It got very, very mixed reception, didn't make a great deal of money by all accounts, wasn't massively successful, wasn't the thing to put Thomas Harris and Hannibal on the map, really.
It's interesting because the reason I ever found out about this film, I think, was, I mean, you're right, Silence of the Lambs completely eclipsed it and made everybody forget about it. But at the same time, I found out about it from watching Moviedrome on BBC Two.
Ah, yes.
And when you look at the introduction that Alex Cox did for that showing, it's still on YouTube. It's very clear that they're showing it as a sort of curiosity because of the cultural footprint of Silence of the Lambs. Mm-hmm. So in a funny way, over time, Silence of the Lambs has sort of pulled this back out of obscurity as well.
Definitely. I mean, it has accrued a sort of cult following in recent years. And of course, I imagine Brian Fuller's Hannibal has done exactly the same thing, as people have gone back and looked at the previous adaptations. This has sort of risen up a little bit. And that's also true in terms of its people's perspectives on its quality as well. As I say, it wasn't very well received when it originally came out. People did not like how incredibly stylized the whole film is. They found it a little bit maybe too artsy, maybe even a little bit pretentious. But it's now garnered more of a following amongst people who appreciate cinema,
It's very, I mean, Michael Mann is a very stylistic director. He's got a very distinctive style. I mean, all his films, they have very distinct aesthetic similarities, so particularly the early ones.
Well, what I like one of the things I really appreciate about this film is that it does understand that cinema is a visual medium, and the story is told as much through visuals and aesthetics as it is through dialogue and exposition. And it really tries. It is trying to do something. It's trying to be something, and I kind of appreciate that.
It's going to be interesting. I'm really interested to hear how you two feel about this, because I think this is my third viewing of it for this, and I still don't really know how I feel about it. I have all sorts of feelings about it that don't quite seem to go together. Like, I feel on the one hand, it's too realist, it's too restrained, and yet because clearly, as Silence of the Lambs shows, and then even more so the Brian Fuller series, the way to do this material is to go gothic and grand guignol, to go for it. That's the way it works. That's the way you get away with this sort of material. So, and it doesn't do that. It's got a restrained and static and clinical style, and it's like stuff like the feds working in their labs and offices doing the police work. That's all filmed and performed in a very realist style, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's actually, I feel, and I can't reconcile these two things, because it's actually quite stylized in some ways as well, as you said. And in some ways, it's more like the Brian Fuller series. It prefigures that more than Silence of the Lambs does, because as you go on, you start getting just a bit of surrealistic imagery coming in.
Very much so. Yeah, absolutely.
You actually get you see Will Graham's vision as he's doing his thing, in a way that does prefigure the Fuller series, and you get you get these surrealistic pictures of the killer's point of view through Will, and it's weird. I can't
Well,
get
it's
it to work
interesting
in my head.
you should say this, because I had a sort of similar set of feelings, and the thing that I couldn't escape, and I wonder if in some ways it's the key to the conundrum, was that it's Miami. So I just kept coming back to the fact that that's where we are, and because
it's incredibly that, isn't it? It feels incredibly
because I think
West Coast, despite the places where things are literally happening. It just feels incredibly West Coast to me.
Well, this is
in the way that
this is the intriguing thing, isn't it? I mean, because it does foreground Miami, and therefore, if you're going to foreground Miami, what you are foregrounding is late period Art Deco modernism. So you get what I kept getting the hit of, and I turned to my partner quite early on and went, well, "This is fascinating." So this is like, I've got to remember we're watching something from 1986. So therefore it's foreshadowing something which is now long past, which is this kind of J.G. Ballard vision of the future, luxury utopianism. You've got the beachside resort. It's very Vermilion sands, cocaine night, supercan. It starts on a beach, you get the ocean. And it's that Ballard thing about characters being hemmed in by oceans and deserts. And then you get the little Art Deco inspired, concrete boxes with all that, the massive glass windows, and, framing
the
segments of
whiteness of it.
seemingly calm and soothing nature.
But aggressive.
And I sort of had to sort of, but I had to sort of trace back through there. That was like, okay, we've got Miami, we've got Art Deco, and then I sort of went off on a bit of a tangent, because like you, Jack, I was like, this is very hard to reconcile. And so I went off down a few rabbit holes in my head while I was watching. Well, Art Deco, as we know, it was actively to break with architecture that either carried an explicit or implicit political manifesto. So it's absence, stylistic absence. And of course, this film's content, pun unintended, is very much about absence. So you've just got this sleekness, haven't you? Symmetry, ergonomic elegance. And Manhunter's aesthetic, because of its setting, it seems to me, suggests absence. It suggests the notion of not needing meanings. The ocean is calm. The neighborhoods are not teeming with people. The psychiatric prison, which contains men like Hannibal Lecter, are inside the Museum of Art. That's the building they used. And so all I kept coming back to was this idea of a kind of wish fulfillment. Nature finally tamed, control finally asserted, just as in a Ballard novel. But as in those novels, where does the sex and violence go? They've got to go somewhere. Under the water are predators. Lecter may be hidden away in his brightly lit, clean prison cell, which I think is, to contrast with that, as you were saying earlier, that on-the-nose kind of gothic hellhole of Silence of the Lambs. That's great. But then you've got Dolarhyde working, his mayhem. So I just kept coming back to the sense of, by choosing this location and everything that it signifies, you get this notion of nature coming back to haunt, the little modernist utopia. Places full of reflections. It's like an aquarium, but the people are the specimens in the glass cases. The clocks are stopped, and it's like, well, of course, this is the 80s. This is Reaganomic 80s. This is the end of history. The culmination of the capitalist struggle will be beautiful people living in beautiful houses forever. But Dolarhyde the serpent. Dolarhyde the horror just under the surface.
And so much of the time,
when I could kind of reconcile it, which was like, okay, it's that location, and because of that location, it allows room for something that leans towards cinema verite, because you've got the police procedure thing, and you've got certain, but also it's unreal. Because only very few people live in those kind of Art Deco environments surrounded by sea and the ocean, and so. And then sort of tying it in with the elements of the story. It's like, I think that's my only way around this, is that it is a rupture. It's a rupture between two contrasting ways to present, because there's such a contrast in the content. And the key thing is absence. It's the absence of things I don't know if I'm making much sense, but it'll probably come out a little bit.
I totally get that, and
Yeah.
there's something almost aggressive about it as well, isn't there? When it's in those sequences, when it's doing the police procedural stuff, which is on the face of it incredibly banal and functional. That's largely what it is. It's characters sort of talking about the plot to move the plot forward, and yet you get these very, very strange, almost like it's either very aggressively up close to a character, or it's very, 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 very far away indeed, and framing them within this empty, like you said, like an aquarium almost.
Well, the thing is, that's that very famous scene, that brilliant scene when Will Graham runs away from Lecter. He's not just running away from Lecter, he's running away from the modernist maze in which Lecter sits at the centre, like a spider.
Yeah.
And Lecter, particularly Brian Cox's Lecter, is perfectly in simpatico with that kind of surface utopia. He's relaxed, he's kind of preppy, he has perfect rapport with technology. I love the scene with the telephone. He can reach the outside world without having to leave his home. These are all modernist, utopian, luxury capitalist ideas. And the worst people in the world are able to take advantage of them. But it does seem like I feel like the Miami is a character in this film because it just seeps into everything. Its architecture seeps into everything. It has a knock-on effect into Mann's direction, has a knock-on effect into Spinotti's cinematography, and it starts to dovetail with the content because all the way through. And Vicky and I were basically saying the same thing. This film is about stuff that's missing.
Yeah,
it's about absences. There's no reality here. It's a great fucking void of a film.
Well, that's really interesting because that kind of ties into the themes. It's so bizarre because the ending of this film, I know we're jumping ahead, but the ending of this film is markedly different from the end of the novel. At the end of the novel, you're left with a kind of a somewhat an existential quandary, effectively, on Will Graham's behalf. He's pondering the events that have happened to him, and he comes to the conclusion that there is this vast, gnawing, almost predatory absence in postmodern living, and he'll never escape it. He can never escape it. It's the void of identity, the vacuum of identity. And the end of the novel is actually very dark. It's very unpleasant. You don't get, like at the end of this film, there's reconciliation. It's very synthetic, and it's something I actually really don't like about the film. I think the ending is pretty bad. But funnily enough, the ending of the novel ties into those themes that are in the aesthetics of the film far better.
They completely change the plot at the end, don't they?
They do completely.
Because in the book, if I remember rightly, the guy that Dolarhyde kills outside Reba's apartment, he then uses that guy's body to fake his own death, doesn't he?
That's right.
In the fire. And then when you think, or you're supposed to think that Dolarhyde's dead after the confrontation, he then pops up again at Will's house at the end.
That's right.
That's all cut, although strangely they leave that guy in. So,
it's so bizarre, right? And it's actually Will's wife who kills him.
That's right. Yeah. So she's completely. She's literally just the long-suffering wife in this one.
Actually, I mean that's another point in this film. The female characters are completely sidelined. They're either victims or they're prizes. There's nothing else.
This film is so about men.
It's just so men
everywhere. It's just men the whole time. Different men. You know, they have so many men in it when they don't. You know, you could have one male character who plays loads of these roles, but instead, it's another new man popped up, and it is so about men, and it's so about how men talk to each other and interact with each other, and how men feel. It's completely about how men feel. You know, how Reba feels is just not
it's
an
completely
issue.
Incidental. In fact, again, a character that's completely sidelined in this film. Her role is so reduced massively in this film.
Yeah, and how Molly feels is only of relevance how it affects Will. And Will's sort of the really important relationship for Will is with the boy, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the one that matters. But another thing they really change about this, as you were saying, the end of the novel is much darker. Will is very seriously injured at the end of the book, isn't he? His face is really carved up again.
Oh yes, he's in a right state at the end of the book, and not just physically either, like psychologically. And I don't think it's actually in Red Dragon. I think it's actually in Hannibal, the book Hannibal. There is a reference back to Will Graham, and he is. It's been a long time since I've read it, but it talks about how he's not with Molly anymore. He's sort of of on his own somewhere now. He is so powerfully damaged by his experiences that he has to be alone now. That's it. He can't function with other human beings
instead,
anymore.
the film is completely about this sort of reconciliation where Will, not Will and Molly, but Will and the boy come to an understanding of each other, because they have this conversation where Will just sort of lays the whole thing out in incredibly simplistic terms. While actually, to link back to what you were saying, Elliot, they have that conversation in the supermarket surrounded by these sort of repeating images of boxes of cereal and coffee, don't they?
Now that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Well, yeah, I mean, he stands in front of. I mean, obviously, there's the Warholian thing about it. I mean, there's a lot of art running through this. There's a lot of pop art. There's a lot of Kandinsky and things like this.
Art, yeah.
But the fact that he stands in front of boxes of cereal, that scream "nut" behind him was like, actually just had me in stitches. And how, you know, but again, it's like when they would cut to the coffee jars as well, and sort of everything reflects this kind of perfectly tailored, coiffured set of eerily distanced people that we meet. But even to the extent that, I mean, you were saying about Molly, I mean, it's noticeable how, and it's not only her, the majority of the characters in this are I can never say this word, somnambulistic. They are the secondary characters, particularly. They drift around beautiful places, sleeping, padding around tiled rooms, vacantly standing about as sentinels. And there's I think that's accidentally interesting.
This film's version of Chilton is a complete non-entity, isn't it?
Oh, he has no presence at all. There's nothing to him. He is a functionary. His only purpose is to drive the plot forward. That is it. There's no substance or character there.
But this is what I think that this is what people. There are a glut of characters in this movie who just strike me that they have succumbed to things. They have succumbed to absence, and that is why they lack a lot of signifiers, and that is why they seem like they're not really there. So we've talked about the sequence with Will and his son, that kind of Warholian repetition and all that superficial gloss. We're in the area of the hyperreal. So that there is the horror of the setting even before we get to Dollarhide.
Absolutely. But it's so interesting, isn't it? Because the film, in terms of its plot, in terms of its narrative, it is very, very simplistic, and even more so than the novel is. The novel does take great pains to try and humanize Dollarhide, to give you some anchorage for why he is the way he is, why he does what he does, and to give you some internality. The film does try to do that, but it fails, I feel. It doesn't do it very well, because it condemns Dollarhide. It doesn't work, does it?
And it races through it. Like, one of the things that struck me on this rewatch is like the entire relationship between Dollarhide and Reba is condensed down so much
Massively.
And it's very strange, because they meet for the first time. Within 2 minutes, he's essentially asked her out on a date, and they do the thing with the
tiger,
the tiger, the anesthetized tiger, and that's like supposed to be later that evening. They've known each other about half an hour. And all the stuff about the old nursing home, the grandmother's home that he still lives in, all the stuff about the grandmother, that's all taken out. The Red Dragon is only just in it. There's one scene where the bit where he goes and eats the original print. That's gone. The tattoo on the back is gone.
The metaphysics.
This is pared right down to nothing.
It is one of the most interesting elements of the film. The fact that the metaphysics is gone. There is no metaphysics here whatsoever.
No. And in fact, not only that, because I know Michael Mann famously covered Tom Noonan up. He said that the tattoo was done. And he covered him up. He said, I think it's going to take something away. The symbolism's too heavy-handed. This coming from Michael Mann making this film, I find quite extraordinary. It's not only the metaphysics that seem to be diminished here. I think even the psychological angle is quite perfunctory. Because particularly, again, with Dollarhide, I mean, it was really interesting to watch Dollarhide, particularly now, after a point where we now attribute names to certain things that weren't there at the time. But Dolarhyde being presented as this socially awkward, isolated, strange. I mean, he's presented with a small disfigurement, the scar from the cleft palate, and these things sort of combine into this idea of self-loathing. That means he, as we know in the plot, he must ascend to a different kind of greatness to feel worthy. Okay, but I think we know where we're going with this, because he murders whole families, presumably thinking that this will be denied him in his life. We have these intimations of homosexuality, which results in the Freddie Lowndes episode, and then when Reba has sex with him, there's this moment of, I mean, it certainly seemed to me, maybe the subtext was, and not much of a subtext, maybe I can achieve heteronormative salvation here, which is undone by a mistake when he thinks he's coupled. This is an incel.
Real problem.
This is what we now would term an incel, or what would be, and obviously the vocabulary isn't there, and the vocabulary can be easily misapplied, and so on.
I think it's even worse than that, to be honest. The way this film codes Dolarhyde in the book, it's actually used
I know where
as it's actually used as a trick. It's actually not. They don't literally believe that Dolarhyde is a repressed homosexual or anything like that, and he isn't. In the books, he's definitely not. In this, they go for that full bore. He's coded so queer. It's
really,
unbelievable.
But
absolutely.
The film itself has got this problem. I mean, to me, I went, hang on, have I missed something? I actually said that in the early stages of the film, when in the ops room, the first reaction to the murder was the line, "Go get the KY Cowboys and the leather bars."
Yeah.
What?
Right.
That's your first suspects. Was this? So the film has got this embedded in it.
It really does. There is a homophobia that runs underneath this film. There really is. Or, I mean, just by the nature of
all of Thomas Harris's work, actually, and I would argue Michael Mann's to a degree.
Yeah. It's a problem.
But what's interesting, though, about the film is where intention and interpretation start breaking down. And the key one for me is in a slightly different area, because I watched an interview with Tom Noonan, who was talking about the scene when he's in bed with Reba, or Dolarhyde's in bed with Reba, and he puts her hand over his mouth.
Yeah.
Now, when I watched that, because of what seems to me to be running through the film like a stick of rock, it looked to me that was an act of him putting her hand over his mouth, almost to say, don't let me put the teeth back in, i.e., don't let me stray outside normal. This be that sexual or anything else. I found something which is acceptable. And yet Tom Noonan said that he put her hand over his mouth as an ad-lib so that she would feel the cleft palate scar to show his vulnerability. And I thought that does not track.
It doesn't translate, does it? It doesn't translate, no.
And it's funny, because my reading of that is completely different. The way I read it when I watched it was he's trying to recreate the moment when Reba feels the mouth of the tiger, because obviously part of what he's doing with the tiger is he's bringing her into contact with a creature that he sees as mirroring himself. He sees himself as a beautiful, dangerous predator. Glory. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?
Of course, of course it is.
And that's what he's doing. He's kind of telling her, without telling her, that this is who I am. This is the kind of creature I am. And he's spellbound by the fact that she finds the creature, with all its savagery and its dangerousness, she finds it beautiful. The emphasis on its teeth, of course, Dolarhyde, his whole thing is that he puts his grandmother's dentures in, which isn't explained in the film. That's not explained. And so later, after, because she's the sexual aggressor, so to speak, they would not end up in bed together if she didn't decide she wanted to go for it, and she basically jumps on him. And when you see them making love, she's on top. In some ways, she's taking the male role. Again, there's some really interesting sort of politics about sex and gender coding there.
Yeah, very much so.
But the bit where he puts her hand over her mouth, I kind of read that as him trying to be the tiger, but he, at that point anyway, he can't do it. the mouth doesn't open, and he starts to cry instead. And I to me, that's a very beautiful moment for him. He feels almost redeemed. He feels human again. But at the same time, it's weakness. He isn't the tiger anymore.
Yeah.
But of course,
And
both
yet
the tiger
it's
and
got
him,
those other things as well. It's got those other meanings too.
Yeah, I think that the point maybe that the tiger and he are both subdued, one by drugs, one by a situation.
Yes, that's
so
it.
the meanings can start to cluster again. But it's interesting. It's sort of getting back to what you were saying as well, George, with all these things link, because while I was watching the film, and this was the frustrating thing about watching the film, was that it actually, I really felt at times that it was a film that was getting, albeit accidentally, close to unpacking homophobia and queerphobia, but ultimately, of course, offering no actual way out of it in a meaningful or noble way, because you have the reconciliation scene at the end. And of course, as I said, the homophobia which runs through some of the characters in the film starts to leak out into the film as a whole.
Yeah.
But there was something there, I thought, and it was the locus of it was Will Graham, because I thought, hang on, this is really interesting. Will Graham in this film, his body is constantly under scrutiny, either by the camera or by other characters. So there's this. So I kept coming back to this thing. Okay, they're lingering over his body in a way that would normally be reserved for a woman in a picture. Certainly at this point. And there's this real kind of tug of war over not only Will's body but his gender. It seems to me, because it's a source of, I think, some quite arresting irony actually in this movie, because I noticed the moment where Hannibal remarked on his tan. I noticed the moment when his peers kept coming back to the scars from the near disemboweling he had at Hannibal's hands, and the way that the character is written, a man, of course, I mean it's in every iteration of Will Graham right up to and including Brian Fuller's series, a man with these purported levels of empathy, traditionally the province of women characters, so much less fiction and film, of course, and a performance, and I think actually the casting helps enormously here, that taps into this kind of nexus of boy, man, woman, and how he, as a character and as the actor playing the character, seems to transition between those states in the film depending on who is looking at him.
Yeah.
So Will as a character, I kept coming back to, for a film that's got a lot of problems in terms of its attitude to gender and sexuality, one of the things that it keeps coming back to is this sort of performative thing of gender, the performative side of gender, how it links or breaks with whatever the given social constructs of the time are. So he's police, so he's coded as being an enemy of anything that, quote unquote, deviates from the heteronormative or the cis or whatever. But he's an outsider policeman. He's on an edge. He's not fully trusted. And of course, the film itself, the semiotics of the film, keep trapping him in halls of mirrors. But also the lingering gaze of that camera on his body and his face, which was curiously androgynous.
Yes, it is. The film is bewitched by his face,
and it was more interested in his body than Molly's body. It was more interesting. I know this. I agree with Jack. This is a film where it's men. But the camera lingers on men's bodies far more than the women's bodies in this movie.
Yeah.
He's got a curiously boyish face as well, hasn't he?
Does.
Very much so. And
just by having a beard and.
Yeah, it's like almost like a false beard. It's almost like it's just one stage above the kind of bumfluff face.
Yeah. I think it's also in the performance as well. There is this, despite the fact that he is this sort of high-profile guy who can do amazing at things, there's a sort of boyish naivety to the way he plays it as well. He always feels like he's slightly the fish out of water, which works very, very well in that regard.
Because he's always under gaze, there is a kind of victimhood that is usually built into women characters because we're in a patriarchal society.
You usually find, like Jack Crawford playing the paternal role in that regard, he's the minder. He's the one who keeps him safe from over scrutiny or ridicule or whatever.
So there are interesting wrinkles in this movie. I don't think it justifies itself. As I say, there's never a point where it sort of says any of these things can be noble or worthy in themselves. It's just these things are deviations because look, Dolarhyde, or because look, but it starts to sort of lurk around the edges.
Yeah, it's very strange. It's part of like the difficulty in trying to interpret this film or trying to determine some clear perspective on it, because its politics seems to be all over the place. The politics of the plot, of the narrative, and the interactions of the characters is at odds with the politics of the aesthetics that you were talking about earlier, Elliot. It's really bizarre in that regard. It makes it difficult to know how to take the film.
Mm. Yeah, and even some of the decisions, which again, this accusation of stylization is, decisions like the use of jump cuts and things like that. I just keep coming back to this thing, as I was saying earlier. You've got these characters that exist within this sort of carefully constructed architectural landscape that is, as you said, art deco, conscious break with the past, absence of meaning, and all throughout these characters are doubled and tripled and quadrupled either by the media around them, because there's security cameras, there is mirrors, there is screens, there's sheets of glass, there is home movies. You've just got a bunch of multiplied victims who have no personality, either because they're psychotic or because they've been sort of simmered down. And then at the center of it is Will, who's the only one who's kind of aware of his own absences, and therefore, or the absences, and it's therefore that these things are making him anxious. It's making him go crazy.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because like when you look at the plot, like Will's function within the plot, he's trying to restore this semblance of order that is manifested in the architecture. To him, the plot seems to say, no, this is good. This is something you should desire, this status, this stability. And yet everything about the aesthetics and the tensions that are drawn are saying the opposite. So it's like, it's confusing. The film is actually quite confused.
I mean, at least there's an attempt to shatter the illusion at the end by crashing through a screen,
crashing through the window,
breaking the gloss,
of course,
and then having to. And I think the important thing is, I wonder if that scene is that he crashes through the glass, he crashes through the screen, because this is a film that realizes ultimately, maybe on some level, that that stasis cannot exist forever. That eventually you have to confront nature and history. You have to be aware of it. You have to the attempt to box it or remove it, create absence around it. I mean, those things birth the horror of Manhunter.
Yeah.
And
it's one of those strange moments, isn't it, where symbolically it kind of works, but in literal terms, it's actually kind of silly.
It's a bit disconnected from the plot as well. Yeah. So it's like,
it really is. And from what we know of Will up until that point, Will's actually been a really timid, kind of static character at that point. He is not an action hero. What he does is academic by and large. What you've seen him doing is, going into the crime scene and recreating it. You've seen him watching videos and talking to himself. That's largely it, and having conversations with Hannibal. The most active he gets is when he's running away from things, right?
Yeah. So
where
does the change come that allows this scene to happen? It does feel very grafted on. It's just right, we're 5 minutes to go, guys. Let's...
Yeah, we've got
becomes very determined at the end, doesn't he, to personally confront Dolarhyde to the point where Jack Crawford is actually saying to him, "You don't need to do this. We got the SWAT team. We got and he just ignores him.
Job, right? This is not your job. You're a profiler, man. You're not you're not an action hero."
Yeah, and he has I don't believe this is in the book. Movie Will has this thing where he sort of talks to the killer. And you kind of need that so that you can have the actor vocalizing some of the things that in the book are just Will thinking to himself. So they set up this conceit where Will, as he's thinking, he talks to the killer the notional killer in his mind. But you get an introduction. I don't think so, or at least not very much. No. But you get this introduction of kind of a competitive relationship. He starts calling him our boy or something like that. Yeah, and he sort of issues these one-sided "I'm going to get you" threats and things like that all the time. And so
they feel like a play of masculinity. They feel like a play
exactly.
of
That's where I was going
to.
That's where I was going with it. If you want to read Will's determination to personally kill the bad guy at the end as more than just the fact that they felt that they needed that in the final reel, so that you've got shots of William Peterson with a gun and stuff like that. If you want to read it as more than that, then it can be read as Will really coming to the point where he feels the need to demonstrate masculinity, alpha masculinity, and specifically to demonstrate it to Dolarhyde, to demonstrate it so effectively that it kills the other guy.
Yeah,
so
to Dolarhyde, who manifests by his very nature a quandary when it comes to prescriptions of masculinity in this film, being as queer-coded as he is, right?
Yeah. It's such a fascinating depiction of the contradictions of masculinity.
Yeah.
I think Tom Noonan is the best screen Dolarhyde, personally.
Oh, yeah, I like him a lot, actually, in this. He's very interesting.
There's no contest from Ralph Fiennes in the abysmal remake, but Richard Armitage does a very, very good job in the television series.
He's such a different Dolarhyde that it almost doesn't... It doesn't really warrant, comparison in many respects. They are so different.
Yeah. But I mean, Noonan is amazing. The way he moves, the way he talks, the way he looks, everything. It's a fully inhabited, physical, emotional performance, and I feel like he's really hooked into something that's really interesting about Dolarhyde, which is this fragile, contradictory, scared, brutal, savage masculinity thing that's going on.
He's trying very hard to evoke
so much.
I mean, not just sympathy, but understanding, right? He's really trying to evoke understanding of this guy. I think at times he is fighting against the script and the direction, though, sadly.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. He manages to get across with his physical performance things that the movie either can't get itself to say coherently or just doesn't seem to be interested in saying at all.
It's another one of those, isn't it? It's a nuanced performance.
Examples of a performance that kind of redirects the film to an extent from within. This is what Christine Kelly and I said about The Shining when we talked about that on a podcast. We said that we came to the conclusion that in a sense, Shelley Duvall directs The Shining. She sort of directs her own version of it from within the film, and I feel like Tom Noonan's doing something similar in this.
It makes you want a different ending, doesn't it? It makes you want something that's a bit more nuanced and that's a little bit more sympathetic towards Dolarhyde.
This is one of the things that is really genuinely fascinating about this story, this book. For all that there are huge problems with it, it does generate an immense feeling of sympathy for the character of Dolarhyde, to the point where you kind of just, against your will almost, just because of how stories work and how we experience narratives, you start to feel yourself wanting him to have a salvation or a happy ending or something like that, despite the horrifying things that he's done. And that's in the film, that's really just touched on in that one scene, isn't there?
And that's it. It's much more pronounced in the book. It's way more pronounced in the book, because I think even Will ruminates on it when he's having his internal monologue at the end of the book. He ruminates on that very thing. I think he does refer to Dolarhyde as a victim. The book version of Will is far more sympathetic to Dolarhyde than the film version.
Yeah, I think
because Will in the book is allowed to feel his similarity to Dolarhyde more than film Will is. Even in that one scene where Will is talking to Jack Crawford about Dolarhyde being, he doesn't know he's Dolarhyde at that point, but the killer being a victim. And he says, yes, I do feel sympathy for the child. But then immediately you get back into that sort of performance of masculinity. Where he has to immediately go to, but the adult man is a scumbag and he should have his brains blown out.
I lose sympathy for the character at that point, and I lose sympathy for the film to a certain degree at that point as well, because that is a statement of the film's politics and morality. And
that's it, bang on, isn't it? Because I made a note of that line, and he says, as a child, my heart bleeds for him. Somebody took a little boy and made him into a monster. But as an adult, someone should blow the sick fuck out of his socks.
I wanted it to stop.
I made a note of that line because then I was like, okay, this is fascinating, because then I couldn't have to I'm gonna have to peel this line because this line does not sit. This thing about Dolarhyde in the act of becoming, children are in the act of becoming. They're in the act of becoming adults.
Right.
Adult is seen as the culmination of that, where agency kicks in. Now, this is where it gets, I thought, interesting, in just the stuff that the film is kind of marinated in. So the personal responsibility lies with the individual. That's Will's philosophy in that moment, which is, that's total 80s ruthless individualism, just there. There's no scope to examine the wider contexts or pretexts that create a Dolarhyde. It's just a case of removing, again, absence, something from the lovely, luxurious, utopian absences so it doesn't mess up the decor. I thought that's a
Miami Vice.
It's Miami, because I think this film really shows up that it's not just this microcosm that refuses such a mess and such a complexity. Will is absolutely terrified of anything that's too big for him to repress. That's what comes across in that scene. This Will Graham, I mean, the Will Graham of Manhunter, he's again, I mean, he's not as he hasn't succumbed to his environment in quite the ways as his somnambulistic wife has, and the other characters. He's still got anxieties about it, but in that moment, that's the moment where it's like, I'm not going to consider anything else. He's a human adult, therefore he has agency, and we got to blow him away. And it's like, wow, that is your Reaganomic moment just there.
Absolutely,
that is,
and that
don't
1986.
For God's sake, don't any of the other men around me, don't for God's sake suspect me of anything untowards, like kindness or sympathy.
Absolutely, yes.
That's
queer. That's queer. That is. Yeah, exactly. We don't want that. I can't have that being attributed to me, right? And
let's face it, they've already been, as far as he's concerned, chipping away at him about these scars, about this attack by a man.
Absolutely. And what happens when that happens? Jack Crawford, Daddy, has to come in and save him, right? And he's doing that all the way through.
It's just like Dolarhyde flying into rages about homophobic rages with Freddie Lowndes and others. It's just doubled there. It's like, wow, that's so strongly felt.
The Will character in this film is seeking father figures all the damn time and resenting them
all
massively.
The time.
You know, because that's what Hannibal is, right?
Yeah. And
absolutely.
This is where it's interesting, as always, with the presentation of some antagonists or villains or evil, quote unquote evil characters. Dolarhyde is in the act of becoming. Only Dolarhyde seems eager for change, evolution in a world trying to halt, freeze, to remain within this one frozen segment forever, which is either the 80s or just as it is exemplified again by this kind of Ballardian environment that they're in, which is like, so everyone's just going to go to supermarkets with repetitions of everything, and everything's going to be clean, and everyone's going to wear beachwear, and at least, I mean, Dolarhyde's actions are horrible, and yet he's the only one who's actually moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's the only moving thing.
Within the politics, within the ideology of the film, he is disruption. He's the only thing that's actually presenting a contrast to what is otherwise stasis and stagnation, and it's fascinating.
It's entropic. The Miami of Manhunter is just entropic.
He's the only challenge that exists to this world of completely static, dead, luxurious, mirror shine consumerists. That millennium.
Identikit families and identikit beach houses and identikit gated communities.
Absolutely bound up with the luxury house containing the American nuclear family.
Of course.
And he's the only challenge to it that's possible, and it's an inherently perverse and evil challenge. There is no other challenge.
And isn't it interesting that the film decides to cut out the only time that you actively see Dolarhyde invade that status quo, which is, of course, when he invades Will's own home at the end of the book.
Yes.
Completely gone. Completely gone. And another disruption to that, which is, of course, that Molly, the woman, is the one who takes him down, right? The fact that the book makes Will at that point impotent, makes him a victim, that's gone too. We can't have that.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Can't have that.
That's a massive gaping hole at the end. The removal of that arc for Molly.
It's bad, but it doesn't work.
the way this Molly is played. I mean, I think Kim Greist is a very good actor. I think she deserved a better career than she ended up with. But she's playing. You know, she must be complying with the general ethos of the production or the director's wishes or whatever. She is playing Molly as very subdued, and she almost seems like a lot of the people in this film. She seems like she's just coming out of sedation, you know, she's.
Well, they're all outside her, aren't they? You know?
It would come out
the only agency it allows her is a very stereotypically misogynistic one, which is she like when she encounters Jack at the beginning of the film, and Jack is trying to convince Will to go off and do his thing. She just does that very stereotypically sort of like passive aggressive thing of not talking to him, because that's what women are allowed in this world, right?
All she has is the standard. Well, she doesn't understand that a man's got to do what a man's got to do.
Absolutely, she doesn't.
The man understood the bigger the man understands the bigger picture and the greater good, whereas the woman can only think about her family, and she can't think beyond the borders of it. You know, she's just got that again, hasn't she? Really,
there's so much inherent to the film that is objectionable. Actually, when you come to analyze it, there is a lot that's objectionable, and I don't want people to think that we absolutely despise this film, because that's not true.
I don't hate this film.
No, I don't either. There are things about it I actually really like. I think it's trying very, very hard to as I said earlier, it's really trying hard to communicate through symbolism and through aesthetics, things like the color palette, for example, which shifts all over the place. That's fascinating. It really is. It's just that the internal politics seems to be massively confused, and doesn't seem to understand. Probably
what would keep me just on the side of someone who would say, I could rewatch this again, I could rewatch it, I appreciate, is that all that stands, but there are some very interesting and accidental wrinkles.
Yes, that's what makes it interesting.
Occasionally get it close to being almost more progressive.
Yeah,
and then it just. I think probably what kills it is that the tensions are interesting. It's the last scene that kills it. There's too much restoration.
Oh my god, the status quo is championed, isn't it, to the nth degree? And there's no, it doesn't even reference these creatures these human beings who become monsters that Will is so familiar with. There is no commentary upon the circumstances and the wider influences that make them what they are. They are just aberrations to be destroyed. And once they're destroyed, it's fine.
Yeah. It's fine.
It's all cut up, isn't it? It's reduced to one line where Will talks about him having been abused as a child, but you don't get any of the psychological stuff about Dolarhyde's background. It's all taken out.
No. But that symbolism is really interesting, because I think, again, as you were saying, George, it's the thing that it's a thing that just fires you off onto different trains of thought. Because because the film has this curious space in it as well, basically for you to notice its visual elements. I was like, there's so much sort of Kandinsky. There's so much Kandinsky-esque art, even if they're not actual Kandinskys, dotted around the film. And I thought, actually, that's just one of those lovely little kind of subtle masterstrokes, because, we were saying this film's very much about. Well, there's a lot of a play of form, rather like art deco itself, intercutting of diagonals, balancing of color, pushing into abstraction, and yet that's exactly what Kandinsky's later paintings are, and yet all his thinking came out of Christian eschatology, the dawning of new ages, the rapture, revelation, artists as prophet, and obviously Dolarhyde working in a photographer's studio, obviously all very loaded. The artist as would be prophet or anti-prophet, and Kandinsky painted shit like the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse before he sort of got into more abstracted areas. So again, it's like you get these lovely little kind of rabbit holes in the film, and it's like, so you notice things like you go, but the background to what seems a completely a form without meaning, which a lot of Kandinsky stuff can appear just on surface glancing, is actually then the man himself is buried with all loaded rather with all sorts of extremely dark, diabolistic stuff. It's like Dolarhyde again. It's Dolarhyde at work in this strange balladian environment.
In that regard, like the purging of some of the elements from the book, like the Blake stuff, the romantic stuff, the metaphysics, again, is curious in that regard, isn't it? Because it's like it's been sublimated in this film. It's like the film operates on multiple levels, isn't it? So you have like the aesthetic, the completely surface conscious level, and then you have simmering underneath this like nightmarish morass of the subconscious, which even the film itself might have been a mite more interesting if it was aware of the fact that it was doing that, and if that was actually like a conscious thing within the film, a thematic thing. But it isn't. It's just something that happens because of the setting.
So, we sort of experience it as an absence.
Yeah.
Well, again, an absence. Yeah. Rather than
very strange.
Yeah. Because there are ways in which things that are not in texts can still be present.
Yeah.
And then there are things that are just not there.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And here it does feel like an absence, doesn't it? It feels like a lost limb or a tooth that isn't there or something. It's very odd. And it makes the film, like, just on a purely visceral level, actually really interesting to experience, because you do need to have conversations like this to understand why it feels like this. Because in and of itself, there's a lot going on here. This is a really full sort of like action-filled film. There's stuff going on all the damn time, and yet there is this feeling of sucking vacuity somewhere at the heart of it.
I mean, it's interesting even in that end, though, what we were saying earlier about the kind of restoration of the status quo and everything, and how it's all, the families put back together, and yet at the same time, because of the imagery and the symbolism that just gets threaded through the film elsewhere, to me it was like, I think I know maybe what you wanted to say with this thing, which was it's Homeric, isn't it? I mean, it's Penelope and Telemachus awaiting the return of Odysseus after fighting the Titan in the form of Dolarhyde, but it doesn't come across like that.
No,
it just comes across as, right, here we go. We got the exactly.
It comes across as glib and slightly empty and perfunctory.
Jack's point right at the beginning, which is if this film had perhaps lent into, as Fuller's series does, and even to the extent as The Silence of the Lambs does, the levels of Grand Guignol or myth reiteration or whatever, that could have been quite striking.
It could have been very interesting, actually.
If she had been cast as a kind of Penelope, or the boy had been cast as a kind of Telemachus figure, and he was being cast as a sort of Odysseus figure, and Dolarhyde was,
that could have been like thematically interesting.
That could have been really fun, because there's already a sort of sense that there's a sense that man almost wants to get into those areas. There's that really curious scene that's just popped into my head as we were talking, where Will goes up in that elevator, and the architecture is like the interior of the belly of a whale. It almost looks like a rib cage from the inside. And all the balconies almost look like they're undulating. And we've got like this almost Moby Dick thing as well.
Or Pinocchio, of course,
becomes the white whale. But he also but Will seems to oscillate between Ishmael and Ahab, because in one he again, Will can't stay in one fixed form. And I think that's one of the film's sort of accidental strengths. It's interesting points.
But it's also one of its contradictions, isn't it? Because it insists endlessly that Will is this absolute like pillar of morality and certainty, and he is the arbiter of the standard, of the status quo, and he is correctness made manifest. It's like, decide.
That leads me to something that really stuck out to me this time, because it doesn't fit together internally. Like I said right at the start, there are ways in which this film goes one way and then goes another way, and they don't connect. The characterization of Will, they add something. I believe I'm right in saying that this isn't in the book. They add a scene, obviously in an attempt to tie into the idea that Will has the potential to be a dangerous person, even to be a killer. They give him a scene where he is actually extraordinarily physically violent towards Freddie Lowndes. I think there's an altercation and a physical altercation in the book, but it's not.
But it's not like that. I think he
physically grabs him and throws him across the front of a car and breaks the windshield. And it's a really serious assault. So they put that in to indicate that, this guy actually there's something to what Lecter says about you're like us, you're like one of us. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the film excises the thing in the book about Will consciously or unconsciously putting a target on Freddie Lowndes' back.
Right.
Yeah.
In the scene when they do the fake interview.
Yeah.
In the book, they're doing the photos, and Will suddenly sort of, without really knowing why he's doing it, or he sort of puts his arm around Freddie Lowndes' shoulder, shakes his hand and smiles. And that is interpreted, certainly by Lecter later on, and then Will, I think, sort of comes to realize the truth of it.
Yeah.
It's interpreted as him putting a target on Freddie for the killer. And that's not in this.
No, they turn it around, don't they? They make it so that Freddie,
straightforwardly reluctant to be in the photograph. He doesn't want to do it, and he gets out as soon as possible. That's just gone. Yeah, and it makes some of the stuff, like, it makes what Lecter says to him on the phone. Oh, I noticed what you did. Good work. It makes that unintelligible.
Yeah, it makes it silly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it just collapses down to that's a snarky thing that Lecter says.
Yeah, that's it. There's no grander weight to it. It's like it wants Will to be narrow. It wants him to be absolute.
It wants him to be good.
Yeah, it wants him to be goodness, and it wants Dolarhyde to be evil. And it's
raining against its own
problematic.
Material.
Yeah, it's enormously problematic because that's not really what the book's about.
It's not what it's about. Yeah, I mean, even the tagline of the film gets closer to it than the actual content of the film. Enter the mind of a serial killer, you may never come back. That's Will, and that is an interesting hook as a tagline. But they fudge it.
It doesn't really happen, does it?
It doesn't happen. You're never in that kind of doubt at all. Yeah.
It becomes even more interesting when you compare and contrast to the other adaptations that exist, of course. I mean, the other one is the film Red Dragon, which came in 2002, I do believe, which is
appalling.
It's just frictionless, isn't it? It's one of those weird films where there's nothing to it. It's like
nothing
complete.
works.
No, it's just complete absence.
The entire thing is ill-judged. The tone is wrong. The music's wrong. The music's by Danny Elfman, for God's sake.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Danny Elfman, Beetlejuice, right? It's great. It's so funny.
They shove loads and loads and loads of more Lecter material in because they realise that the only thing anybody's really interested in is coming back to see Hopkins play Lecter again.
And
he's in it far too much. And Hopkins is openly taking the piss out of him.
He just doesn't care. He is giving one of the most I could not give a shit performances. Give me my paycheck and let me go.
You have Edward Norton giving a performance that is so earnest, it's just completely bland. It's just like a glass of water.
Yeah.
Ralph Fiennes is bad, frankly. It's just terrible, the whole thing.
It is a bad film, and of course the other adaptation, which we'll get.
It's trying to be like a Revenge of the Sith style prequel that leads into the next film.
Yeah,
isn't
it's
it?
true. That's exactly what it's doing. It's trying to be like a prequel to the Silence of the Lambs, isn't it? And it's like, come on. I mean, I actually have enormous problems with Silence of the Lambs, especially more recently. But come on, really.
I prefer Manhunter to Silence of the Lambs. I'd rather sit down and watch this again.
Yes, me too.
Agreed. Yeah.
Me too. I think it's a much more interesting film.
I think, it's the problems of Manhunter. As I say, they run into interesting accidents and interesting flaws.
They precipitate exploration as well, as they have here in this discussion. But the problems with Silence of the Lambs don't necessarily.
No, they don't. But the other thing I think with Manhunter, I think the accusations against it at the time, this is so stylized. Now it's in that wonderful situation, which I think will just continue the older it gets, of just looking weird.
Yeah, very weird. Because
it's again, it's that it's something we've talked about before. I mean, certainly for Jack and I being that little bit older, it's sometimes you're confronted with the 80s in certain films, Michael Mann films, Brian De Palma films. You sit there staring at it, going, did I live through this? Because this is another world.
The direction of this film is actually really strange, isn't it? Sometimes it feels, sometimes it feels like it's trying to be cinematic and that it's aware of certain cinematic trends, like in European cinema and whatnot. And then other times it feels like it's a TV movie.
It feels like a TV movie.
Yes.
And so many times. Yeah.
Yeah, like that freeze frame at the end. I did not know that happened over the credits, where you actually get the 1980s freeze frame over the credits that so many like comedy films do, and it's like, oh my god, really?
And also you've got
some of the music, particularly the sort of the needle drops. They are so cheesy. They are so cheesy.
It is cheesy, but at the same time, the thing that I think almost neutralized that for me was, again, things that happened later, because I suddenly realized that an enormous amount of different sense was being made of those moments because we live in the post-American Psycho world. So I just kept thinking, my God, this is the... can you still hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, right, sorry. We're watching this film where there are these kind of Phil Collins-esque pop pieces mixed with this kind of curious mix of Jan Hammer and Vangelis and
Iron Butterfly.
And it's like, oh, hang on a moment. This is like American Psycho, but earnest.
Yes, exactly. Very much so. Very much so.
So it's like, you have these. Now I've got these images of, and I'm thinking more of the film, which is the superior version of American Psycho, I think.
Oh yeah. The film stops where it should stop, whereas the novel goes on, and it's like, no.
She had absolutely the right idea, the director, to treat it as a macabre comedy.
Yeah. Totally.
And so all the way through sections of Manhunter, I'm like, where's Christian Bale? Where's he coming in? Because then suddenly there was this almost future shock about it, where I felt slightly unsettled by those needle drops, because it's like, oh, but this is being done seriously, and therefore what I should find cheesy, I found kind of weirdly unsettled.
This is one of the things. This film and how this film appears to people is going to be, it's a hostage to the passage of time, because it is so incredibly specific to a particular moment, aesthetically it is so 80s, and sort of the lazy way of saying that is that it's to say that it's dated. That's not really what I'm getting at. It is intensely late 80s.
So I think
things like that, their reputation and their reception does depend upon the passage of time, because obviously how we experience the past changes the further away we get from it. So we feel different about a period of time 10 years ago to how we feel about a period of time 30 years ago. And when the 10 years ago thing becomes the 30 years ago thing with the passage of 20 years, you then feel differently about it again. These things happen a lot. And but Michael Mann is a director he's not just a director of his time or his moment. He is actually particularly fascinated by the aesthetics of the 80s world that he's living in. He makes his films about those things, about the styles and the music and just the overall feel of the world at that point in time. Certainly this version of Michael Mann is anyway.
Definitely,
there are times when watching this, it almost feels like a pastiche of an 80s movie made in 2012.
Yes.
And it has that other, I think, interesting thing, which is here in spades. It's also somewhat in Heat as well, but as we're talking about Manhunter, which is, yes, it is intensely of that period, but it's also you're aware of the point of rupture, because at that point in 1986, the world it's offering, the image of the world it's offering, which is partly rooted in a kind of Miami Vice wish fulfillment and partly in a kind of J.G. Ballard-esque, or is it utopian, is it dystopian, is that it was a vision of the future that never actually happened.
Right.
We all thought that was kind of the way the future was going to be.
It's a media phenomenon.
It was it was the end of history, and that was going to be kind of, although neoliberalism has provided us with a logic of, well, it's the present plus a bit more. It's the present plus a bit more. It's the present plus a bit more. It's very, very concrete in that film, where that looked like the end of the cul-de-sac. And of course it's not.
No.
So that also, it's not only its intense 1986ness, it's intense that version of 1986, which was going to be the pathway leading to now, and it wasn't.
Yeah.
And relatedly, it's very much it's not really of 1986. That's not the real 1986. It's the constructed media 1986.
Media, yeah.
Like you were saying earlier, you look back at stuff from the 80s and you think, did I live through that? And the answer to that is kind of no, because we didn't really live in that 1980s, except to the extent that in the 1980s we were being told by the spectacle that we lived in that 1980s.
It's what you were talking about earlier, Elliot, when you said it was almost like Baudrillardian, when it was like a hyper-real state. That's essentially what it is, right?
I mean, there's a wonderful, a visual irony at the beginning of the movie, in which where Dollarhide's Super 8 camcorder footage feels more real than anything else, and yet that's ostensibly him behind a camera shooting.
Yeah,
but when we get to what we buy into the conceit that we are watching a film, we don't actually, although we are media literate, but we do try to forget that there's a camera, but you have this extraordinary layering in the beginning of the film, where it's like, well, this feels of no time. This feels real. It's because it's this Super 8 camcorder footage, and then the film slips into, what the hell's this? And then you get this kind of hyper real pop art thing and yet that's meant to be the real thing.
I mean, that must have been an interesting thing at the time, contextually, because of course it's almost presaging found footage in a way.
Yes,
and that really wasn't a thing at the time. That wasn't really a concept
you've probably got.
It was just
Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, wasn't it? Which was I think a couple of years later.
Yeah, it was just starting to be a recognizable aesthetic, because people had just, historically speaking, people had just started to have home video cameras.
Of course,
so
that's right.
That handheld, low quality, home shot VHS aesthetic, that was just coming into people's consciousness, wasn't
it? Of course. So which makes it in and of itself uncanny, right? It makes it it makes it scary and new and bizarre. I mean, I was thinking of when I was watching it this time around was a film just from bang up to date, which was Skinamarink. It looked like the film's. Watch that one, please, guys. Watch that one. I think everybody has a different reaction to it, but I loved it.
This film is getting towards, as you say, it is getting towards found footage, because it's already got, with the opening section through Dollarhide's camera, it's already got that gothic inflection of home video footage, because that's the quintessential gothic, in that it's disturbing and uncanny, but it's also familiar. So it's already there. But it ties in with this film's preoccupation with lenses and photographs and films,
images, all kinds.
The film is. It's constant in the film. I mean, Will is persuaded to come back into the case by looking at photographs and VHS home video recordings of the family. There's the ambivalence with which news photographs are felt. They use them to try to catch the killer, but at the same time, they're an invasion of Will's privacy on two separate occasions. There's Dollarhide's whole thing about looking. He turns the eyes of his victims into lenses where he sees himself. He works at a photographic developing store. There's Reba's blindness. It goes on and on and on. This film is just
this is why I think the
cameras and images.
There needed to be more made of the smashing through the screen, because that's loaded with possibilities, but it just sort of happens. I do agree with you, Jack, about in terms of linking it back to Will's progress through this kind of performed masculinity. I agree with that, but I'm talking about in terms of the way the film has brought so many elements of media or into it, or reflection, screens, mirrors, and brilliantly the idea of in certain scenes where Will is so divided up. I mean, the symbolism of the divided self and so on. And I wanted the breaking of the screen to stand for more than it did. It sort of didn't really stand for anything.
It feels like it wants to, doesn't it? It feels like the film wants it to, and it just doesn't. For some reason, it falls flat. It doesn't work.
The film goes some way towards forging a kind of a coherent thematic statement with this, because it is obsessed with images, recording, cameras, things like that. And it does tie it very particularly into sexual and gender dynamics, particularly in the realm of performed masculinity. Dolarhyde makes his victims, quote unquote, watch him. I mean, it's strongly implied that what he's doing is having sex with the wife. He's raping the wife as she dies. And later on in the film, it's implied that he films himself doing that. Well, that's the performance of masculine dominance and power over the heteronormative, completely supine, dominated domestic woman, etc., etc. He's performing that for the camera. Will's dick measuring contest with Freddie Lowndes is about photographs, but it's also about masculinity. It's about nakedness. He's upset when Freddie Lowndes captures him outside the mental hospital because that's a moment of distress and weakness. The big thing with Freddie Lowndes is that he comes into the hospital when Will is recuperating from the first illnesses, and he takes his pictures when he's prone and supine and helpless and wounded in bed, and it's also his body again. It's also
there it is.
The problem is his revealed nakedness. So the film is getting somewhere with this, and the way Dolarhyde feels able to make a connection with Reba because she can't see him. He has power. He has hiddenness from her. So his self-consciousness about his appearance isn't an issue, but it's also power over her. Which, oddly, of course, the thing that nearly brings him to the point of some kind of redemption is the fact that in reality, in practice, when they actually do have a moment of intimacy, it's kind of her power over him. Because, as I say, she's the sexual initiator and things like that. But it doesn't quite work, does it? It doesn't quite link up.
No, it's actually more powerful in the Brian Fuller series. It's much more powerful for some reason.
It's a shame because Tom Noonan pulls some really good moves. Really does. Like for one of the things, like whenever she kisses him, he keeps his eyes open, and it's little touches like that where he seems very plugged into what the film could be doing, and a lot of what the film is doing. I mean, I can be a little fairer on it, and just those uncomfortable moments, like his shock when she kisses him, but I mean he and later when that sort of plaintive look, I mean, because the scene is kind of crass. It's like, oh, you've misunderstood something and you feel cuckolded and therefore you're going to go on this murderous rampage. But again, the way he's playing it, of just a kind of that look, almost a camera from inside the truck or the van, it's such an intelligent performance. He's layering on more layers than the script is affording him, unfortunately. But I did read, he did sort of make the suggestion to Mann, which he took, which is like, I think it would be better if I'm never around. So they did separate bookings for flights for him and separate hotels, and his Winnebago was not on the same site as everyone else's Winnebago for between, and therefore it could really. I mean, I think it's true to say that the take with Freddie Lowndes having the blindfold taken off and seeing Tom Noonan as Dolarhyde is the first time he saw him. And it's quite interesting. His reaction is a little bit of fear, but he almost laughs, which is actually what you feel like doing as a viewer. Because the interesting thing about that way that scene is played is the fact that Tom Noonan plays his dialogue so matter of factly. It's like they're just in a in a boardroom or something, or they're at some meeting at work, and it's like, now can you read this?
He never gets near the grandiosity that he's trying to portray, does he?
No, it's always such a good choice.
Yeah, it works. It really does work in the context of this film. It makes him perpetually pathetic and
because there's a point where I think Freddie Lowndes really does think he's going to be let go.
Yeah.
And that creates a much better tension than if you're in a scene with an actor who's playing it with such heaviness that, you know, the other character already knows that it's a sort of a futile request. But there's a lovely tension in there where you really feel as though Freddie Lowndes thinks, oh, he might let me go. I mean, it's the most frightening scene in the film for me.
It is, and it's also one of the more interesting ones with regards to his queer coding as well, of course, because you get that interesting shot when he does bend to bite Freddy. You don't see him bite Freddy; it's framed like a kiss.
Yeah,
you cut to the outside of the house.
Far less graphic than in the series.
Oh my God, yes,
which is
very much
terrifyingly graphic.
Yeah, it's absolutely hideous in the series. It's brilliant, but it's hideous.
But and again,
well done in the. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, even the scene which they very, very smartly rework for the series of Freddie Lowndes in the burning chair. It's very fast. You almost don't see what it is, which is interesting. There's no lingering on that moment, which is quite odd.
Man's not. He's really not interested in focusing on gore and violence.
No.
It's because it's kind of messy. You know, I don't think he likes that.
There's hardly.
I mean, he likes everything to be neat and tidy and smooth and clean, doesn't he?
There's hardly a drop of blood in this. It's a spectacularly bloodless film. This one.
He shows you as little as possible. He shows you as little as possible, even of the blood-drenched crime scenes.
Yeah,
he shows you enough, but no more than enough.
Although it was curious that when they did go to the crime scene, because everything was so clean and everything, and he was so restrained. I must, when the shot cut to the interior of the bedroom, I went, oh shit, because I was like, that's a lot of blood, because it's not expected in that by that point.
And also, it's not part of the color palette, not the general color palette. You don't see those reds.
Green,
it's an explosion,
blues,
right?
And yellows, and therefore I think it's the first red we see. So it's like, what?
It's a bit of a shock. It's a little bit of a shock.
The emphasis on
it's in the white marital bed and whatnot as well, obviously.
And the emphasis on broken mirrors is interesting, given that man does have this fetish for smooth, clean, shining surfaces.
And that very curious scene, which I can't say, like, being like ridiculously dim, I can't really understand what its significance was. But the scene, I mean, it's an effective scene, but I don't see what it really. Maybe you can help me with this. The scene on the aircraft when his photographs slip out of the sheath and the young
little girl
sees them. I'm not really sure what that scene's for, other than it's just.
I'm not entirely sure. It's almost. I mean, it could almost be a joke, couldn't it, in its own gallows way? But it doesn't. It doesn't land in that.
But
regard.
I think this is sort of symptomatic of things that happen in Manhunter. They just sort of happen.
Yeah,
and you are left with a bit of what really was the intention behind that?
Things get stated repeatedly as well. There's a sense of redundancy about a lot of this, and that's what I feel about that scene, actually, because I know what it's doing. It's saying, yet again, I'm ambivalent about cameras and photographs, and it's saying, yet again, look at the ironic difference between these photographs of the family before and the photographs of the family after. And it's saying Will is steeped in this world of horror and violence, and at the same time he's dreaming about his family, and there's a similarity between his family and the families. You know, it's saying all this stuff, but it's kind of already said that 3 times.
Yeah. So then, by the time it's saying it the 3rd time, the meaning starts leaking away from it for me. I mean, then I'm like, well, is that really all it's saying, or is there something I'm missing? Because, as you say, there's been repetition, and so you're
it's like it's afraid you won't get it. You know.
Yeah. It's like those things where they start. You see certain films and certain TV series that do this, where they start dialoguing the themes.
Oh God.
What are you doing?
Oh yeah.
You got it.
Sat around talking about the themes. Yeah.
So why are you doing that?
And I think Christopher Nolan is quite influenced by Michael Mann, isn't he? And Christopher Nolan, as we've talked about before, is a real criminal there, putting the themes into the dialogue so that
and
you
making
definitely
sure that
understand
you
what his
know.
film's about.
That's making sure you know that the film is about themes.
Indeed, and what they are with a checklist. So I find something really. There are some absences in this film. Again, absences. But there are absences in terms. I mean, for people who know the story very well. I mean, I certainly feel like I know the story extremely well because I've read the book and watched 3 screen adaptations.
Yeah, right.
And there are some strange gaps in this version that surprised me all over again watching it this time around. Like, firstly, there's one moment that to me is a very sweet and quite a crucial moment in the film, in the story, and it's completely cut from from this version, where Will talks to Reba in the hospital after her rescue, and she's saying, I attracted a monster, and he says, no, you attracted a man with a monster on his back, and he tells her that he was trying to change for you, and that connects with the fact that the whole thing about stealing and eating the print is taken out as well. And I feel like those are crucial gaps, but the one that damaging gaps, but the one that really puzzled me on this rewatch was that the film doesn't tell us that Hannibal Lecter is a cannibal.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. In fact, there is a curious line. There is a really curious line in this film, and I remember thinking about it when I watched it the last time, and thinking, did he just say that? Because I'm sure it's not in the book. Will says when he's talking to his son, when he's explaining to his son that Hannibal was preying on college girls.
Yes,
college girls.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? That's not in the book.
What the hell?
That's not in the book. And it's so contrary to the way Hannibal operates in the world of the books.
So different to the Hannibal as we think of him, isn't it? Because it sort of collapses him down into a Ted Bundy figure or Edward Kemper sort of. Yeah,
it's massively reductive for the character, isn't it? But then again,
it doesn't even mention that he's a cannibal. It doesn't.
No, it doesn't. You're right.
Mention it.
But going back to what you said a moment ago, Jack, the reason that scene with Reba isn't in it, where Will explains that you didn't draw what he says, she says, I drew I think she says I drew a freak, and he says, no, you drew a man with a freak on his back. The reason that's not in it is because it elicits sympathy for Dolarhyde, doesn't it? It's again, it's this. It seems to be anything that makes Dolarhyde more complex and more interesting, and Will more complex and interesting in terms of his empathy for the character is ripped away to make it narrower, to make it simpler.
And yet, ironically,
weirdly at the center of the film, you have this. Yeah, exactly. Weirdly, at the same time, at the center of the film, you have this performance from the actor who's trying to do exactly the opposite. Who's trying to show you the. Yeah.
It's very peculiar. The whole film it's fascinatingly peculiar. And given what you were talking about earlier, Jack, when you were talking about the effects of time on media and the perspective upon media, I think now in 2023 this film almost comes off as surreal.
Oh yeah,
it's so strange.
It's a very, I mean, I again, and this isn't to be terribly patronizing, but I think if you're from a younger generation and you come to this film, and unless you've made it a point of study to look at the 80s, it would be incredibly peculiar.
And also just
maybe fascinatingly so. I don't think necessarily be repellent or what the hell am I watching? It would just be very curious.
Yeah, and parts of it would be camp. Parts of it would be kitsch as hell. Certainly the ending sequence would be as kitsch as all get out.
Yes, it really is.
But the knock-on effect of that, because it's something that crossed my mind when I was watching it last night. How odd this would be if you had no. If you weren't sort of connected to that era, even as we said earlier, that it wasn't really the era we experienced, but it was the era that was we were constantly told we were experiencing through its movies, through its advertising, through MTV, through all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the knock-on effect is you start thinking, well, what am I watching when I'm watching a film from the 60s? What am I watching when I'm watching a film from the 50s or the 40s? What? And one of the real revelations is that happens time and again is if you get contemporary criticism of, particularly if it's movies, and so often I find as you come across something which is because of that time lag, because of that distance, and it's now a masterpiece, something absolutely monumental, and you read all the notices at the time, they slag it.
Oh yeah,
they slag it on the basis of it. Oh, it looks crap. The effects are rubbish, and it's like, and it's a film from the 40s or something. And like, wow. What conduits do these things run down? And of course it's because, as always, it's a later generation playing archaeology on a generation that they weren't part of. But
this ties in with something
that's one way, and it doesn't.
This ties in with something that really fascinates me, which is that as time goes by, we get our sense of what past eras were like, primarily from the media that is most closely associated with them. I always think when you read the 19th century novel, you will get, whether it's M.R. James or Conan Doyle or whoever, Charles Dickens. This is it. We don't, when we think of the Victorian era, we don't think of the Victorian era. We think of the Dickensian era.
That's right.
That's what we think it was. And when you read depictions of working class people in those sorts of stories, that they always have they sort of replicate the manners of speech, and and all we have really of working class people from the 19th century is the versions of them that were put into stories by upper class men writing stories.
Really?
So we don't know what these people actually sounded like. We know what they sounded like to Charles Dickens. And even when you go to writers from that period who are more they're trying to be more realist than Dickens obviously is, like
a Goldsworthy or something, or
Barchester Towers,
Trollope.
The name just wouldn't. I was thinking Thackeray, and I knew that wasn't it. You're still getting a version. You're still getting a media version, essentially. And this is it with this film. We are getting the 80s as it looked to Michael Mann. And as I say, as you were saying, George, it is almost kitsch. And we were saying before, it's almost like a pastiche or a parody of an 80s movie made in recent years.
It does feel like that at times, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The other film of its kind, in a way, that has a similar, I think it's a similar setting. I think it's the same setting. I think it might be Miami as well, which is Brian De Palma's Scarface, which also,
of course,
looks very kitsch.
And
very camp. And
it also has a tiger in it.
Also has a tiger, of course. So it is, and you think, well, that's a vision of the 80s which is really disparate from anyone who lived through. But as I say, you start pondering earlier decades, or the century before last. We're in the 21st now, and it really scrambles your mind. You think, well, my God, it's all fourth and fifth hand news, really.
And the fact that we've reached that point with an era that we happen to live through as well, to a certain degree, that's fascinating.
And then there's an extraordinary thing that's happening as well, which is also kind of new. I mean, it's also, I almost say it's
oh no again. We've lost him again.
Oh, it's Pipes. Pipes is in the works again.
Pipes. That's another one, by the way, Jack, that I've got to rewatch this season.
Oh yeah,
definitely. That's got to be how
I've mentioned. I think I've mentioned before that there are certain things that I deliberately don't watch too often because I don't want to become over familiar with them. And Stone Tape and Ghostwatch are definitely in that category. But I think enough time has gone by since I last put them on that I will put them on this Halloween. I love them.
Are you back, Elliot?
Are you back? I don't know.
He's here. He's here. There's a presence. I sense a mysterious presence, a distant voice floating in from the ether.
Oh, it's become a seance now. That's interesting.
Is there anybody
Well,
there?
I think so. I think I'm here. Yeah, I got back on. No, I was just going to say, but it's a very new phenomenon. At least I can't think of anything like it from before. Which is, I've been having this kind of love-hate watch with the new, well, one of the more recent Star Trek Picard, and I've been sort of box setting it, and the situation of watching actors who are now in their 70s or in their 80s, in the case of Patrick Stewart, and then them suddenly cutting to footage from episodes from 1988, 1992, from when
Really, they do that,
and they do that, and it's the most striking thing that we're now in an era where the shelf life of actors has somewhat elongated, particularly if they're part of something that was hugely successful and therefore it's felt, we must bring that back.
Yeah.
So you're watching actors who are now old in scenes which barrel into scenes showing them younger. That's quite a new thing, because either it would be a recast if it was a remake of a movie or something, but that's really, I mean, that I can't think of any time in the past where that's happened to quite that extent.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I haven't watched
really a
Picard
new phenomenon. You're
myself,
watching
but
the old in scenes that then cut to scenes of them being young, and it's the same actors.
Yeah, that's really
a very
strange.
new media phenomena that I've not come across.
And also,
before.
I mean, like, is it actual footage from Star Trek: The Next Generation episodes?
Yeah.
Right. No, that's fascinating, because like
they've managed
everything...
to balance up the color and everything, so it doesn't look like you're watching a piece of footage from a completely different.
No, that's what I was going to ask.
They've worked on the imagery so that it looks pretty seamless.
Yeah,
the lighting levels seem correct, and but it's still very strange where you get this scene where Jonathan Frakes as Will Riker remembers an event from his past, and they show it, and there he is, aged 30 or something. It's like,
surely, I mean, like, technologically, there's only so much you can do to mask the fact that it's the 1990s, though, because things like just the writing and the cadence and the rhythms of television were different back then.
Well, they're only using it very sparingly. I mean, they're using like tiny bits of scenes to help that feed into the plot of the new thing, but it's still a very a new phenomenon. I mean, I can't think of any time. What I'm trying to say is I can't think of any time in any previous media until kind of this era where that's been done.
Yeah,
because actors aren't brought back so late in their lives to do things.
The only thing I can think of that's sort of remotely like that is the Scorsese movie The Irishman, where they have De Niro and Joe Pesci, I think, isn't it? And they're for loads of the film, they're CGI de-aged.
Yeah.
So you get a performance essentially from De Niro 20 years ago.
Yeah, but the slight, I would say, still the slight difference is that you are kind of aware of an effect being deployed there, but the actual cutting between two different pieces of footage which have been aligned. That's I can't, because you couldn't do it before, because like I said, actors were people live longer for a start now, in certain swathes of society, but also actors seem to be able to, certain actors seem to be able to extend their careers longer and everything. So it's just a very curious image, because it's just never something I've seen before. So
they would never have, for instance, like cut a bit of the original series into one of the Star Trek movies, would they?
No,
They wouldn't have had a flashback in Wrath of Khan to scenes that they'd cut out of Space Seed.
Yeah,
they wouldn't.
It would look too different, wouldn't it? I mean, but it's also the massive amount of ground covered between the 60s and the 80s in terms of technology and everything. It slowed down a bit, but also the technology now exists as I say, to match the two images a bit more. So they do feel of a continuity, they feel of a consistency, but it's still just the strangest thing to watch
and
an actor at an age suddenly cutting to an actor when he was young, and it's all compressed into the same sequence of events. I've never experienced that before in a film.
I haven't seen it, but I imagine that in a funny sort of way, it probably feels unconvincing because we are trained by the media that we watch to expect that when we see something like that, when we see a narrative depiction, a visual narrative depiction of a character remembering something that happened to them when they were young, and you get a flashback, you get the wobbly screen or whatever, whatever shorthand they're using to tell you it's a flashback. You've been trained by media to expect it to be a youthful lookalike actor.
You're absolutely right. And the
so
first
when
thing that happened when they did the hard cut was that doesn't look convincingly like Jonathan Frakes, but it was. It was Jonathan Frakes.
That's right. But it doesn't look convincingly like the younger version of the character because it's actually the same actor, and we're trained not to expect that. We're trained to expect a different actor doing that.
Yeah. Fascinating.
And it's a very striking. Because it's almost too much for the perception to quite deal with. Because it's like, well, who's this guy? Well, of course I know who this guy. I know who this guy is better than the guy who's older because I grew up watching that. So your head is scrambled, and
also it can't help being a massive fourth wall break, can it? Because the minute that happens, you're just instantly aware as a viewer that of what you're watching. You're just instantly aware of what's happening. So you're taken out of the story into thinking about
it's
the various iterations of these characters in different series and editing them in. And
but as I say, I've had the strangest kind of love-hate watch with it anyway. Some bits have been, it's a rather like Manhunter. Some bits, the bits I liked were really glorious. The bits, the difference is the bits I didn't like with Manhunter irked me, but I think they were also somewhat cushioned by their 1986ness, like its politics and so on. It's irksome, but it's okay. I'm aware of the context of what's going on here. Without dipping into that kind of condescension of posterity or anything. You're kind of aware what films and media were doing in 1986 and the kinds of things they were saying and the kinds of things they were making jokes about. But with this, it was more the bits I liked, I loved, and the bits that fell short, I bloody hated. God, I think more than anything, it's like,
I've been getting your dispatches from your rewatch a little bit over WhatsApp, and it's funny. You'll be describing it, and I'll be thinking, oh, maybe I should give this series a go, and then you'll describe something else the next day, and I'll think, no, not watching that.
No, maybe not.
I mean, I finished it now, but I was so deep in. I was waist deep into it, so I was like, well, I'm just going to push through. But it was that awful situation where I watched the first about 6 episodes of the first series just as background while I was doing rather boring tasks, boring kind of admin tasks around my work. And it was fine because it was just background, and occasionally it'd be, oh, there's Pat Stewart, oh, isn't that lovely? And then it sort of hit this point where it got good. And it was around about episode 7, and then episode 8 followed, and that was good. And episode 9 was like, wow, this is really good. Then we went into the second series, and the beginning of the second series, I thought, wow, this has got some really interesting things to say. Oh my God, this isn't shying away from stuff. This is being quite direct about certain things that are happening in our world, and it's doing that lens on the world that good science fiction can do and good speculative fiction can do. And then it was like, no, what the fuck is it doing? And then it just went on some absolutely dire tangent for about another 5 episodes, and then it's like, well, okay, I mean, I'm 2/3 of the way through, I might as well see the final season. And I think the oh God, why am I boring you with this? But I think the one point I said, and maybe this will appeal to you, George, being a writer, but for all the things that you could level at the creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, in many ways he was bad for his own show. But I think one of the really perversely inspired things he came up with when Next Gen took off was he basically got all his writers in a room and said, I don't want any conflict between these characters. It's cheap. And of course, all the writers went, but that's drama. Drama is turbulence. Drama is conflict. And he said, you're going to have to find new ways.
Find another way.
I actually I totally agree with you, because that's a very, as far as I'm concerned, that's a very reductionist view of drama.
Massively.
So many forms of drama. And one writer, and I can't remember his name, but one writer who went on to be quite big in Next Gen was like, no, I thought it was great, because it was suddenly I had to rethink. The thing about this version of it is that edict has been thrown. So what you end up with is these really tedious conflicts between characters you ostensibly love if you've grown up, but the only possible resolution to them is that they have to back off conflict with each other, else the plot doesn't advance. So it's like, why even bother? Because this isn't helping. We actually prefer to watch these guys get on and chip in ideas at each other and resolve the big, because there's never not going to be a conflict, because they always have a villain or an antagonist or a situation. So suddenly the series gets clogged up, and it's so dispiriting, because you see these characters, particularly if you're invested in them as a kid, which I was, being really horrible to each other.
Yeah.
And you're like, why are you being horrible to her? And why are you being horrible to him? And why are you shouting at it? And so it was all started. Yeah. And then, of course, I was 2 episodes at the end, and it started getting good again. It was like, no, I can't do this.
The great thing about TNG back in the day, when it was good, was that it had that utopianism, didn't it? It had an idealism to it. And that's a huge part of where that came from. You didn't have that sort of internal sniping between characters. The show was saying, there are ways to deal with these things that don't involve conflict, that don't involve infighting and stuff like that. And that's the world that these people live in. And of course, they're the question of exactly what sort of utopia we're talking about with Star Trek is, one for another time. Maybe it's a big, complicated, interesting question. But it is at least trying to be utopian in some sense. Yeah. And I feel like modern Star Trek just isn't that. It's like modern Star Trek, and it kind of gets started in the later TV 90s ones, like in Deep Space Nine and stuff. The whole idea of the Federation as like a utopian society starts getting undermined. Yeah. It all looks very cynical, and
this is very cynical.
And here we are. And we just don't seem to be able to imagine a utopian future or a better future anymore.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, this is the thing I said to my partner. I said, Gene Roddenberry's, he's dead now. He's probably among the last people who use science fiction as a way of saying, hey, we can all get better. I said, because even his creation now, I mean, this show is grimdark. It's full of kind of cheap conflict. But it's not only that. It's like and it sounds almost an ironic thing to say, because obviously this is the continuation of something that started in the 80s, but the way it genuflects to the original series, it's like, oh, we're back to Kirk worship. It's like, why can't they get away from this? They got away from it in the 90s, sort of after Gene Roddenberry died, but we're right back to not being able to do anything that isn't schematic of the original series, or that's just on its hands and knees. Well, it's on its belly crawling around. Kirk and Spock and McCoy.
That may be the Star Wars effect. That may be because of the loudness of the fan base.
Yeah, and it's like, my God, the show, what's going on? Anyway, but as you said, that's just really a conversation for another time. But it just came out of that thing about that curious media, where it's like, that 1986ness of Manhunter. And now we're in this, as I say, this curious thing that I've never noticed before, where because of it seems to me the potential for actors to go on much longer. And again, it's a very neoliberal thing, because no one wants to take a punt on anything new. They're just going to keep digging up the corpses of old things. Yeah. They want the old actors into, but the cutting between the fresh media, where they are the age they are now, and the old media, the age they are then, it was properly head scrambling, and entirely new. I've never seen anything like it. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. I mean, I do tend to try and avoid the sort of like nostalgia media myself at the moment because I want something different. I want something new, you know.
Yeah. I mean, as I say, my motivation was literally to have something for my for the rubbishy admin side of my job, just to have on in the background, and it literally just came out of, oh, it'd be nice to see Pat Stewart.
I mean, I've heard, you know,
so poor guy, and so it's like I'd like to see him, you know, but then you sort of get drawn in, and then you get repelled, and it's like, oh.
But no, I mean, Manhunter, guys, what a strange experience this has been.
Yeah, strange, interesting, ambiguous, unsatisfying, but also really interesting.
Yeah, and really fruitful, right? Really, I mean, it really does generate discussion. And I will go back and watch this again because it is interesting. I won't go back and watch Red Dragon, you know.
No.
But this is the thing. I mean, I'm looking at the films on my shelf in front of me, the DVDs on the shelf in front of me. There's so many films there. I don't know if, you know, they're not successful, or they're not you know, entirely elegant, and some I don't even know if I actually quite like them all that much, but they have a pull.
They have something.
They don't need to work fully.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely.
Something incredibly perverse, like, you know.
Comparison's really instructive, I think, because this film, for all that it's muddled and it's got its problems and so on, and it has an independent identity as a piece of art. It has an integrity. It has its own vision. It has genuinely its own approach. The remake, the Manhunter, the Red Dragon film from the early 2000s, it is completely and solely a corporate product. It's nothing else. It's that they wanted to squeeze some more money out of Hopkins as Lecter, and it's got no other vision or nothing. It's got nothing apart from doing that.
And this is the thing.
It was the era when. Sorry, Jack. Go on.
Yeah. I was just going to say, it's a bit like what you were saying about the new Star Trek stuff genuflecting to the original series. The Manhunter, the Red Dragon remake movie from the 2000s, that completely grovels and crawls to Silence of the Lambs because it desperately wants to be Silence of the Lambs because it wants Silence of the Lambs receipts.
Receipts.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it.
And this is it. Things don't have to be successful. I mean, I think more increasingly so, because Vicky and I having this conversation, I was saying, you know, I'm probably, I give an awful lot of the benefit of the doubt. I said, it's only really cynicism that bugs me. And when something is made or put out there and no one really cares about it, I said, if it's a complete mess, but you can tell that the people involved were invested in it, it's just come out wrong, or it's slightly misjudged, or it's messed up in some way. But if you can sense that that belief, you'll still run with it. And there's a lot of that in Manhunter. It's like this is the work of people who really believed in this project. The project hasn't fully pulled off, but no one's approached it sort of half-assed.
No, I think it goes a long way. It really does. If there's sincerity, if there's passion involved, if the people involved actually do want to say something or explore something, that goes an enormous way. Certainly,
the fact that they did interviews 25, 30 years later with Brian Cox and William Peterson and Michael, and they were still talking about it so passionately. I mean, Cox did 3 days on that film, and you know, shooting. I mean, there was rehearsal as well. There was a lot worked out, but he still talks about it with such passion.
Yeah.
And he's probably he is the shortest running Hannibal, isn't he? I mean, in terms of screen time, but he's
the George Lazenby of Hannibal.
He's the George Lazenby of Hannibal. But his ideas, and in the interview, he was talking about, you know, how he approached it, you know, what his feelings still are on it. And you think, my God, you know, you fully invested in this, and you're an actor now talking about it 30 years on, and you've still got all those ideas and memories, and you know, you can see him getting charged up and excited by talking about this project. You think, wow, that's amazing. Nothing can be worthless if that's the effect. You know?
Absolutely. And you know, we're here talking about it as well. It is something that generates discussion. If we try to do one of these about Red Dragon, then we wouldn't get anywhere.
Good luck.
We wouldn't get anywhere. The only thing we could do. is carp, right? The only thing we could do is carp about it.
We might get an hour of complaining and bitching about it. You know, that's the
about
best we
it.
could do. Which I'm not saying wouldn't be fun. I'm just saying.
No, I'm sure
why
it would, but we've never. Have we ever done a completely negative one? I don't think. Actually, Jack, you and I have. Yes, you and I
was going to say the closest we've done is sort of
Poltergeist, the remake.
2/3 of this show and 1/2 of one episode of 2/3 of this show, which was the Poltergeist remake.
Yeah. And that was fun. I will admit that was fun to bitch about.
That was about half an hour
about
of
Poltergeist because I could only do the first one because that was the only one I'd seen in years.
Of course.
I have managed to see the second one since.
Oh, have you?
And that is, yes, which I mean now I need to listen to your podcast.
Yes, of course.
That's a really
that's a film, right?
Unusual film. Again, it's rather like I've got the Manhunter about it. It's like I watched Poltergeist 2 about 2 months ago. I'm thinking, how does this film exist? How did this film follow the other film?
Flawed but interesting,
Yeah, very much so.
There's a lot going on in that film. It's I mean, Jack and I discussed it at length, but I love that film. I really do. I really enjoy that film. Yeah. Have you seen the third one yet, Elliot?
No, I haven't gone that far yet.
Yes.
But I guess I can make a date with that too.
Yeah, would recommend.
We kind of agreed, didn't we, George, that the third one is a mess, but it's a really interesting mess.
It's a really interesting.
It's very interesting mess.
Great stuff in it.
Yeah, I mean, like it's one of those strange things where it has some of the best individual sequences in the entire series, but isn't quite as coherent as a whole.
Something I like to do with stuff like that is imagine, what if this film wasn't a sequel? Like with Poltergeist 2 is a really good one to do that with. If you just imagine that it's not called Poltergeist 2, it's just called Poltergeist, or it's just called The Other Side, or whatever. It's not a sequel to another movie. It just came. Imagine that it just came along exactly as it is.
Yeah.
It wouldn't exist, would it? There's something about the sequel that it's something about the way it has to be sort of crowbarred into shape around the original work that gives the sequel a particular feel, a particular sort of awkwardness. You know, an unplanned sequel. I mean. Yeah.
This is where sequels can be great because they can only happen because the first film exists. I mean, that sounds dunderheaded, but I'm not quite getting across the point I'm trying to make. But they can only, but for that very reason, it's like, otherwise it's like looking into a sort of alternative dimension where a film that could never possibly exist, save for it being a sequel to something else, suddenly does exist. And if you can make that leap and go, okay, I'll just imagine this is the first. Again, it's another one of those head scrambling things. You think, wow, there's no circumstances that this could be made else. So this is why I have an interest in
original Star Wars isn't it? Because, I mean, George Lucas spins an awful lot of bullshit about what he had planned in advance and so on. Most of it's just nonsense, but it does. Original Star Wars does start in media res. So, I mean, it's fashioned as like the latest installment in an ongoing B-movie series. That's part of what it's doing. It's part of what its style, its resurrection of that old style. So it does in some ways feel a bit like a sequel to a film that you haven't seen yet. And of course, now we've got all those sequels. They made them. They made the prequels.
They
didn't have.
I mean,
they have to fill any space because again, they want to sell the ticket.
Yeah, completely. I mean, for a serious what the fuck, I think several of the 1970s James Bond films, if you imagine them being the first, you would just fall off your chair. I mean, how could that possibly happen? It's like, what am I watching? How extraordinary.
One series, oddly enough, where they could, Live and Let Die wouldn't just come along on its own.
I mean, that's absurd. That in fact, you've chosen probably the most absurd example. How could that exist if there weren't a bunch of films before about that format, about that character?
You need the contextual knowledge of the entire rest of the series in order to make it intelligible. don't
Yeah,
you?
to understand it shorthand and whatnot. Yeah.
And yet, ironically, I think it was the first one I ever saw.
Now that is fascinating, isn't it? Because that you can actually sort of have this experience, can't you? When you actually come to the sequel first, rather than the original, it can make for a very strange, very unique experience.
I saw
sure
Aliens before I saw Alien.
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure I saw
funny enough,
Jaws 2 before Jaws.
That's an
I'm
example.
sure I did.
The original sort of first three movies, the Alien trilogy, as it used to be called, that's actually an example of an instance where it could work. You could actually imagine both Aliens and Alien 3. I think we said this when we talked about Alien 3, George. You could imagine it as just a standalone film.
Yeah, I think so.
Alien 3 is like this curious British art movie. If it wasn't for Alien and Aliens.
I think that's why they do stand in and of themselves, because they're all so stylistically different.
Yeah,
they're all trying to do different things. They may as well be alternative universe versions of the same mythology.
And I think it actually, in many of the cases, helps them.
Yeah.
Because the only way I can watch Aliens, which is not a film I'm terribly fond of, but I can enjoy myself watching it. But the only way I can watch it is to completely or not connect it to Alien. And it's the same thing with the more recent movie, not some of the pretty dire ones that came later, but what was the one where the big comeback, where it was the prequel, Prometheus. I can watch Prometheus as long as I don't really connect it.
Notoriously hates Prometheus.
Don't get me wrong, it's beautiful. I mean, it's like aesthetically beautiful, but I do think it's one of the stupidest films I've ever seen in my life.
It hammers out some of the ambiguities of Alien that I adore, but if I imagine it really not being Alien, I can sort of get on board.
It's a funny thing with that series of movies. You can actually kind of imagine a lot of the sequels as being standalone movies. You can imagine them as existing in different continuities, and it still works.
Well, given how different they are tonally as well. I mean, you look at Alien Resurrection, for example. That does not fit with the rest of those films.
No. The first three don't fit with each other, but the fourth one doesn't fit with the other three.
What the hell is this?
Yeah. But for whatever reason, 2 and 3 both treat Ripley as a mystery at the start, and I think that's part of why they work so well standalone.
That's a good point. And of course, we're in this wonderful thing of where we can play around with media. So not only in those terms, but I mean, in some, I mean, my cheap trick is, and I did it recently with, I really wanted to rewatch Gattaca, which I haven't really seen since.
It's a long time. I've seen that once back in the day.
Yeah, and I put it on, and I mean, we were about 10 minutes in, and I said to my partner, "Do you mind if I put this into black and white?" And she said, "Oh, please do." And then suddenly it was, it just took another level. Not every, you can't do that to every film, obviously, but there's just certain films where it's like, wow, this is works, hitting. It's just hitting something else now. Yeah.
Oh, you mean like the Snyder cut? Yeah, I get it.
Don't do this to me.
Let's not. Well, guys, Manhunter.
Guys, I think we've hunted the man.
I think we have.
Man has been.
I think we have.
Well and truly hunted.
Well, there was no point as hunting for any women in that film. Let's be honest.
No, definitely not. Which is fine by me, Guys, before we leave, is there anything that you'd like to advertise or pimp out?
I'll go first because
please do, Jack.
You've got stuff.
You cannot now find everything I do via Twitter because I'm not there anymore. I have my account's still there. So if you go to Twitter and you find my account, you will find links to everything that I do in the back catalogue of tweets. But I do not go to Twitter anymore because I do not like it or the individual who owns it at all. I'm now on Blue Sky. At one of those long and unwieldy Blue Sky URLs or names.
That's maybe one of the things they need to sort out at some point, One
of the many things, yes. But I am on Blue Sky. So if you search Blue Sky for Jack Graham, you will find me, I expect. And I blog at Eruditorium Press, and I Substack at Times Carcass, and I have a Patreon. And if you give me some money on Patreon, you will get advanced access to all sorts of things, including this, for instance, and other shows, and a back catalogue of exclusive podcasts that are only for people on my Patreon, and bonus episodes to my main thing. We're still on hiatus, but we are coming back. My main thing is the podcast I Don't Speak German that I do with Daniel Harper, and it's about nasty people, like, for instance, the guy that owns that website that I don't go to anymore.
Yeah.
So that's me, really.
Links below, guys. Links below.
Yeah, I just basically hang out with these guys when I can. So I've got really nothing to pimp out really at the moment. I'm a work-shy fop, so.
Fair enough. As for myself, guys, same as usual. You can find me here on Exaggerated Elegy, where you can find loads more podcasts like this and video game Let's Plays. Lots of those going on at the moment. In terms of written work, you can find links to all of my published work over at strangeplaygrounds.com, or if you go on to the Evil Empire of Amazon and type in George Daniel Lee, you'll find all of my short story collections there knocking about somewhere. If you go over to Arrow Films, you will find, I think it's still up for pre-order. It's not released yet, but there is the new big shiny Blu-ray set of Hellraiser. And myself and our mutual friend Kit Power are on the Hellbound DVD, on the featurette Hell is What They Wanted, where we chat about the film for a decent amount of time. Beyond that,
I know that hasn't been released yet because mine hasn't arrived yet.
No, well, there you are. There you are. Up for pre-order, though, guys. Please go check that out. We had a blast doing it, and we're so pleased with the product. It's. I mean, I think you might even be a little bit shocked, Jack. It looks very professional. It looks really good, and they made us look good in it, which is great. You know, proper lighting.
That's easy. You're both extraordinarily handsome men.
Oh, thank you so much. We do try.
As is Elliot, in fact. I hate being the ugly one here. It's really annoying.
I just hate I think hearing you just basically give your credits is like, I'm just sat here going, God, I feel like an amoeba. And this guy who's just been like allowed to come onto their podcast, who's got just like nothing to offer the world, really.
I think that's everything. You can still find me on Twitter at the moment, but that probably won't last too much longer. I'm currently transferring everything to Blue Sky, like Jack, so I will put links to my new Blue Sky account as well. Beyond that, I think that's everything, guys. Thank you so much. Again, it's been lovely getting back into the swing of this, you know.
Yeah,
good stuff.
It's been our sort of segue out of Hannibal Digested back into Same Log.
Yeah. And of course, after this period, Hannibal Digested will be coming back. I mean, I'm still very eager. Yeah, absolutely it will, because it's been so much fun to do. With that, we will see you soon.
Yes, for Pete Walker's House of Mortal Sin. That's where we're going. That's right, isn't it, guys? That's the film we're doing next, isn't it?
That could be an interesting one to do.
I liked the sound of the other one. Was it Whiplash or something?
House of Whipcord. Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
One of the greatest reactionary movies of all time.
Maybe someday. Until then, bye guys.
Take care. All the best.
Bye everybody. Enjoy Spooktober.
Oh, you too.